We should make a very clear distinction here that often when people are embittered and resentful and feel like they're victims, it's because really awful things have happened to them. Now, not always, but often. And so then the question is, well, if you're in a situation and something really awful is happened to you or has happened to you, then, well, why shouldn't you feel like a victim? And is there a better alternative? And part of what you were trying to lay out in this part of the book is what those better alternatives are. So part of looking for that hero is to find out from someone else's example. In your case, it was your mother, but these other sources that you described of people who were in a sort of hell in an undeniable sense, but who chose in a very real way to make it as good as it could possibly be given the circumstances. And so they had to turn to sources of power, let's say, and strength and fortitude and resilience that weren't, in some sense, obviously associated with the catastrophe. I mean, in your mother's case, it's a pretty tragic situation. She's a young mother, she has young kids, now she has breast cancer, and she fights a losing battle over a period of 5 years. That's pretty bad. And then you have to ask yourself, given that that's obviously pretty bad, how is it even possible that someone could handle that with not only grace and courage, but the kind of grace and courage that leaves their children with an an immovable sense of the ability to prevail in the face of the deepest adversity. I mean, that's really something. You said here, thousands have come before you and they did just fine. So quit your complaining. And it's not because you have nothing to complain about. That's not the case. It's that that's not the right approach. The fact is, and this is such an optimistic fact, as well as a judgment in some sense, the fact is that if someone else can do it, so can you. And that's something, right? If you're reading about the great heroes in history, people who are in these terrible situations, and you see someone rise to the occasion, and then you can say, well, that was a person who did that, and I'm a person, and so maybe I have that capacity too, even though I don't know how to approach it. And then some of the rest of your book, much of the rest of your book, I would say in some sense is a guide to help people figure out how they could approach that. One of the things you point out first is, well, notice who you admire, and then maybe try consciously practicing becoming like that. When you see someone in the depths of genuine suffering, hopefully what you're trying to do is to throw a lifeline, and one possible lifeline is compassion. And that's probably the right lifeline to throw an infant, who's suffering, that sort of overwhelming compassion. But for someone who is an adult or making progress towards being an adult, the lifeline that might be thrown is there's something within you that would let you be more than you are, and much more, and maybe enough more so that you could actually deal with this suffering so it didn't turn into hell and take everything along with it. And there isn't anything more optimistic than that. You say something here, which I think is I'm going to read something from your book here. It is true that character is to some extent innate. I would say what that does is that it provides each of us with a range of talents and a range of temptations. And so it's something like that. So it's the hand we're dealt, and there's certainly a genetic element to that. Our genetic makeup imbues in us certain proclivities. But it is as true that character is mostly a consequence of choices. Strangely enough, we all make them, and we should make them deliberately, with the knowledge that these choices are part of our responsibility toward a purpose other than our own selfish aims. That responsibility is to your family, friends, community, and country. That's something that conservatives put forward as a pathway to virtue. And what's so interesting about that, as far as I'm concerned, as an antidote to atomistic liberalism, let's say, that hyper-privileges the individual, is that it's definitely been my observation as a clinical psychologist that in the depths of misery, the capability that you have to be of service to other people, your family, your friends, your community, your country, that's actually a saving grace under such circumstances. And that people really find a deep and abiding meaning in that service. So it's not just finger wagging and the pointing towards duty. It's like, no, you don't understand. that if you're in desperate straits, if your life has fallen apart, if you're nihilistic and miserable, and maybe you have your bloody reasons, because maybe you do, that's still the case that if you step outside yourself and you try to make the lives of other people better, that's the best possible thing that you can do for yourself. We should make a very clear distinction here that often when people are embittered and resentful and feel like they're victims, it's because really awful things have happened to them. Now, not always, but often. And so then the question is, well, if you're in a situation and something really awful is happened to you or has happened to you, then, well, why shouldn't you feel like a victim? And is there a better alternative? And part of what you were trying to lay out in this part of the book is what those better alternatives are. So part of looking for that hero is to find out from someone else's example. In your case, it was your mother, but these other sources that you described, of people who were in a sort of hell, in an undeniable sense, but who chose in a very real way to make it as good as it could possibly be given the circumstances. And so they had to turn to sources of power, let's say, and strength and fortitude and resilience that weren't, in some sense, obviously associated with the catastrophe. I mean, in your mother's case, it's a pretty tragic situation. She's a young mother, she has young kids, now she has breast cancer, and she fights a losing battle over a period of 5 years. That's pretty bad. And then you have to ask yourself, given that that's obviously pretty bad, how is it even possible that someone could handle that with not only grace and courage, but the kind of grace and courage that leaves their children with an immovable sense of the ability to prevail in the face of the deepest adversity? I mean, that's really something. You said here, thousands have come before you and they did just fine. So quit your complaining. And it's not because you have nothing to complain about. That's not the case. It's that that's not the right approach. The fact is, and this is such an optimistic fact, as well as a judgment in some sense, the fact is that if someone else can do it, so can you. And that's something, right? If you're reading about the great heroes in history, people who are in these terrible situations, and you see someone rise to the occasion, and then you can say, well, that was a person who did that, and I'm a person, and so maybe I have that capacity too, even though I don't know how to approach it. And then some of the rest of your book, much of the rest of your book, I would say in some sense is a guide to help people figure out how they could approach that. One of the things you point out first is, well, notice who you admire. And then maybe try consciously practicing becoming like that.
It's not an accident that the axiomatic Western individual is someone who was unfairly nailed to a cross and tortured. It's like, yes, right, exactly. So what do you do about that? Well, I thought about that for a long time too. It's like, well, you don't get together in a damn mob, because all that does is allow you to be as horrible as you could possibly imagine and suffer from none of the consequences. That's a bad idea. So how about we don't do that? Well, there's a deep idea in the West too. It's like, pick up your damn suffering and bear it and try to be a good person so you don't make it worse. Well, that's a truth. You know, I read a lot about the terrible things that people have done to each other. You just cannot even imagine it. It's so awful. So you don't want to be someone like that. Now, do you have a reason to be? Yes. You have lots of reasons to be. God, there's reasons to be resentful about your existence. Everyone you know is going to die. You know, you too. And there's going to be a fair bit of pain along the way, and lots of it's going to be unfair. It's like, yeah, no wonder you're resentful. It's like, act it out and see what happens. You make everything you're complaining about infinitely worse. There's this idea that hell is a bottomless pit, and that's because no matter how bad it is, some stupid son of a bitch like you could figure out a way to make it a lot worse. So you think, well, what do you do about that? Well, you accept it. That's what life is like. It's suffering. That's what the religious people have always said. Life is suffering. Yes. Well, who wants to admit that? Well, just think about it. Well, so what do you do in the face of that suffering? Try to reduce it. Start with yourself. What good are you? Get yourself together for Christ's sake, so that when your father dies, you're not whining away in a corner, and you can help plan the funeral, and you can stand up solidly so that people can rely on you. That's better. Don't be a damn victim. Of course you're a victim. Jesus, obviously. Put yourself together. And then maybe if you put yourself together, you know how to do that. You know what's wrong with you, if you'll admit it. You know there's a few things you could like polish up a little bit, that you might even be able to manage in your insufficient present condition. And so you might shine yourself up a little bit, and then your eyes will be a little more open, and then you can shine yourself up a little bit more, and then maybe you could bring your family together instead of having them be the hateful, spiteful, neurotic, infighting batch that... So then you fix yourself up a little bit, kind of humbly, because, you know, God, you're a fixer-upper if there ever was one. And then you got to figure out, well, can you figure out how to make peace with your idiot brother? And probably not, because he's just as dumb as you, so how the hell are you going to manage that? And so then maybe you get somewhere that way, and your family's sort of functioning, and you find out, well, that kind of relieved a little bit of suffering, although it reduced the opportunities for spiteful revenge, and that's kind of a pain in the neck. And so then you get your family together a little bit, and you're a little clued in then, at least a bit, because you've done something difficult that's actually difficult. You're a little wiser, and so then maybe you could put a tentative finger out beyond the family and try to change some little thing without wrecking it. It's like, our society is complex, and we teach our students that they could just fix it. It's like, go fix a military helicopter and see how far you get with that. It's like, what are you going to do? You're like a chimp with a wrench. Whack! Oh, look, it's better. It's like, no, it's not better. Things are complicated, and to fix things is really hard, and you have to be like a golden tool to fix things, and you're not. So, and that's the other message of the West. It's like, how do you overcome the suffering of life? And I'm not saying it's only the message of the West. How do you overcome the suffering of life? Is be a better person. That's how you do it. Well, that's hard. It takes responsibility. And I think, you know, if you said to someone, you want to have a meaningful life? Everything you do matters. That's the definition of a meaningful life. But everything you do matters. So you're going to have to carry that with you. Or do you want to just forget about the whole meaning thing, and then you don't have any responsibility, because who the hell cares, and you can wander through life doing whatever you want, gratifying impulsive desires for how useful that's going to be, and you're stuck in meaninglessness, but you don't have any responsibility. Which one do you want? Well, ask yourself, which one are you pursuing? And you'll find very rapidly that it isn't the majority of your soul that's pursuing the whole meaning thing, because, well, look what you have to do that. You have to take on the fact that life is suffering. You have to put yourself together in the face of that. Well, that's hard. Christ, it's amazing people can even do it. I'm stunned every day when I go outside, and it isn't a riot with everything burning. Because really, God, you talk to people, it's like, I knew this guy, he'd been in a motorcycle accident, and it really ruined him, and he was like a linesman, you know, working on the power, and he was working with someone who had Parkinson's disease, and they had complementary inadequacies, and so two of them could do the job of one person, and so they're out there fixing power lines in the freezing cold, despite the fact that one was 3/4 wrecked with a motorcycle accident and the other one had Parkinson's. It's like, that's how our civilization works. It's like, there's all these ruined people out there, they've got problems like you can't believe. Off they go to work and do things they don't even like, and look, the lights are on. My God, it's unbelievable. It's a miracle. It's a miracle. And we're so ungrateful. College students, the postmodern types, they're so ungrateful. You know, they don't know that they're surrounded by just a bloody miracle. It's a miracle that all this stuff works, that all you crazy chimpanzees that don't know each other can sit in the same room for 2 hours sweltering away without tearing each other apart, because that's what chimps do. So, anyways, so what happened? Well, I made some videos, and I got to the bottom of some things, at least as far as I can tell, so I told you what the bottom is, and then I got this idea about what you might do about it, which isn't my idea. It's like, it's not my idea. It's an old idea. It's far older than Christianity. It's old. It's the oldest story of mankind. Get yourself together. Transcend your suffering. See if you can be some kind of hero. Make the suffering in the world less. Well, that's the way forward, as far as I can tell, if there is any way forward. You don't have to necessarily have done anything wrong for things to get completely out of control. It's a terrifying doctrine, but it's not a hopeless doctrine because it still says that there's a way forward, there's a pathway forward, and the pathway forward is to adopt a mode of being that has some nobility so that you can tolerate yourself and perhaps even have some respect for yourself as someone who's capable of standing up in the face of that terrible vulnerability and suffering, and that the pathway forward, as far as the existentialists are concerned, is by, well, certainly by the avoidance of deceit, particularly in language, but also by the adoption of responsibility for the conditions of existence and some attempt on your part to actually rectify them. And the thing that's so interesting about that is, well, too, as far as I'm concerned, and some of this is from clinical experience, you know, if you take people, and I've told you this, and you expose them voluntarily to things that they are avoiding and are afraid of, you know they need to overcome in order to meet their goals, their self-defined goals. If you can teach people to stand up in the face of the things they're afraid of, they get stronger. And you don't know what the upper limits to that are, because you might ask yourself, like, if for 10 years, if you didn't avoid doing what you knew you needed to do, by your own definitions, right, within the value structure that you've created, to the degree that you've done that, what would you be like? Well, you know, there are remarkable people who come into the world from time to time, and there are people who do find out over decades-long periods what they could be like if they were who they were, if they spoke their being forward. And they get stronger and stronger and stronger, and we don't know the limits to that. We do not know the limits to that. And so you could say, well, in part, perhaps the reason that you're suffering unbearably can be left at your feet, because you're not everything you could be, and you know it. And of course, that's a terrible thing to admit, and it's a terrible thing to consider, but there's real promise in it, right? Because it means that perhaps there's another way that you could look at the world, and another way that you could act in the world, so what it would reflect back to you would be much better than what it reflects back to you now. My experience is with people that we're probably running at about 51% of our capacity. I mean, you can think about this yourselves. I often ask undergraduates how many hours a day you waste, or how many hours a week you waste, and the classic answer is something like 4 to 6 hours a day. You know, inefficient studying, watching things on YouTube that not only do you not want to watch, that you don't even care about, that make you feel horrible about watching after you're done. That's probably 4 hours right there. You know, you think, well, that's 25 hours a week, it's 100 hours a month, that's 2.5 full work weeks, it's half a year of work weeks per year. And if your time is worth $20 an hour, which is a radical underestimate, it's probably more like 50 if you think about it in terms of deferred wages. If you're wasting 20 hours a week, you're wasting $50,000 a year. And you are doing that right now. And it's because you're young, wasting $50,000 a year is a way bigger catastrophe than it would be for me to waste it, because I'm not going to last nearly as long. And so if your life isn't everything it could be, you could ask yourself, well, what would happen if you just stopped wasting the opportunities that are in front of you? You'd be who knows how much more efficient, 10 times more efficient, 20 times more efficient. That's the Pareto distribution. You have no idea how efficient people get. It's off the charts. Well, and if we all got our act together collectively and stopped making things worse, because that's another thing people do all the time, not only do they not do what they should to make things better, they actively attempt to make things worse because they're spiteful or resentful or arrogant or deceitful or homicidal or genocidal, or all of those things all bundled together in an absolutely pathological package. If people stopped really trying just to make things worse, we have no idea how much better they would get just because of that.
You write in the book, there is no faith and no courage and no sacrifice in doing what is expedient. What do you say to those viewers that don't pursue their dreams and are locked in their careers because they are too afraid to take risks and pursue something meaningful?
Well, the first thing I would say is, well, you should be afraid of taking risks and pursuing something meaningful. But you should be more afraid of staying where you are if it's making you miserable. You're paying a price by sitting there being miserable. You might say, well, the devil I know is better than the one I don't. It's like, don't be so sure of that. The clock is ticking.
Yeah,
and if you're miserable in your job now and you change nothing, in 5 years, you'll be much more miserable and you'll be a lot older.
But isn't it a luxury to pursue what is meaningful? Our viewers have mortgages, they have children,
Yeah.
they have payments and loans. It's
Well,
a luxury to pursue because we lack the resources.
Well, I don't remember now, I'm not talking about what makes you happy. It's a luxury to pursue what makes you happy. It's a moral obligation to pursue what you find meaningful. And that doesn't mean it's easy. It might require sacrifice. If you need to change your job too, let's say you have a family and children and a mortgage, you have responsibilities. You've already picked up those responsibilities. You don't just get to walk away scot-free and say, well, I don't like my job, I quit. That's no strategy. But what you might have to do is you think, well, this job is killing my soul. All right, so what do I have to do about that? Well, I have to look for another job. Well, no one wants to hire me. It's like, okay, maybe you need to educate yourself more. Maybe you need to update your curriculum vitae, your resume. Maybe you need to overcome your fear of being interviewed. Maybe you need to sharpen your social skills. Like, you have to think about these things strategically. If you're going to switch careers, you have to do it like an intelligent, responsible person. That might take you a couple of years of effort to do properly. We're built for struggle, us human beings. We're built to contend with the world. We're built to contend with reality. You want a challenge, and the best way that you can take on a challenge, because a challenge fortifies you. So you don't want to be secure, you want to be strong. And you get strong by taking on optimal challenges. And so you lay out your destiny in the world, and you take the slings and arrows of fate, and you make yourself stronger while you're doing so. And you might fail, and fortune might do you in, but it's your best bet. And, you know, people have extracted unbelievable successes out of catastrophic failures. And so, and I'm not saying that in a naive way. I know perfectly well what happens to people. You know, you're doing fine in life, and then you get cancer, and then 6 months later you're dead. And all the heroism in the world isn't going to save you at that point. But that's not the point. That's not the point. Life is bounded by mortality. But that doesn't mean that you don't get out there and contend. And you develop by contending, and you minimize the net amount of suffering in the world. And that's something, man. That's something to do. If you're thinking about your past, what it means is you haven't analyzed the causal chains. Because you might say, well, why do you remember your past? Well, you might say, well, it's in order to have an objective, you know, record of the past. It's like it has nothing to do with that. There's only one reason you remember the past, and that's to be prepared for the future. That's why you remember the past. And so what you're supposed to do is take the past and extract out from it wisdom. And wisdom is the ability to avoid stumbling blindly into ditches. Here's a time in my past I stumbled blindly into this horrible ditch and terrible things happened to me. You need to take that apart. You need to figure out, how was it that events conspired with your participation, voluntarily or involuntarily, so that that terrible consequence emerged. You need to know why that happened and how you could react differently in that situation. And as soon as you do that, your brain will leave it alone. It won't obsess you about it anymore, because the anxiety-producing parts of your brain are basically trying to tell you where there are obstacles in your environment. Don't go there, there's fire. Maybe you could master the fire, right? Then you're a wielder of fire, you're not just a victim. And lots of situations are dangerous or not dangerous depending on your level of mastery, right? Life is like that. And so a negative emotion that's associated with a memory is something that's crying out for mastery, and writing can really help with that. You're reorganizing your brain when you write autobiographically. Imagine emotion. Memories can be stored at different levels of your brain, from sort of primordial, reptilian, image-laden areas that are very emotional, up to finely articulated plans for your future life. Well, you want to take everything that's negative and emotional and transform that into a fully articulated vision for your future. And that frees you of your past. You shouldn't be thinking about your past.
mean, maybe if you're 80 and, you know, you're going over a well-spent life, that's a whole different thing. But if you're 30, 35, or 20, and most of the time you're thinking about your past, it's like your soul is trapped back there. You need to free it through investigation. And the metaphysical language is appropriate, because that is, in a sense, what you're doing. You're trapped in the past. It's like you got to break free of that so you can use all your resources to move ahead into the future.
Imagine someone that you treat well, that you love. Then try to treat yourself that way. You got to detach from yourself a bit. You got to think, okay, well, I'm a person among other people, and I deserve at least as much respect as a person among other people, and I should be trying to help myself across time. And instead of being self-contemptuous and self-destructive, I need to take care of myself as if I'm potentially valuable, and to lay out my life that way. And so that's what that chapter is about. And it's hard for people, you know. They don't take care of themselves as well as they should. And I don't mean, you know, take care of yourself. I mean, that isn't what I mean. It's like, it's not a moralistic attack. It's like, it's an encouragement to give yourself a bit of the benefit of the doubt. Take care of your room, take care of your things, like have some respect for yourself. It's like there is a lot of potential within you, and there's many things that you can do, and you're necessary more than you think to the unfolding of things. Like, if you make a bunch of bad decisions, things get worse, not just for you, like things get worse. And so it matters what you do, and so part of what you do is you want to treat yourself as if what you do matters. And so you want to have some respect for yourself.
Young people like to think about ways to change the world, right? And that's actually a positive part of their development. It's a stage that the developmental psychologist Jean Piaget called the messianic stage, and he associated that with late adolescence. While young people want to change the world, the problem is that that's been harnessed into attempts to change other people. But that isn't what you should do. If you want to change the world, you should change yourself. In the sense that Alexander Solzhenitsyn said when he analyzed the Soviet Union, he said, don't be thinking that the line that divides good from evil runs down a political spectrum or countries or something like that. It runs right down the middle of your soul. And if you want to sort out the world, then what you do is you sort yourself out. It's a serious business. They say it's more difficult to rule yourself than to rule a city, because you're complicated, and there are horrible monsters inside of you that need to be tamed and to be brought into alignment and submission, so that you can be a powerful and useful person. And instead of rushing out there to change the world by changing other bad people, that they should look inward and sort themselves out properly. And if you have a memory that's more than 18 months old, approximately, and when you pull that memory up to mind, if you still have an emotional reaction, that means you haven't fully articulated the memory. You haven't analyzed it causally. You haven't freed yourself from its grasp, and you're carrying it like a weight. And your brain responds to that. Like, the more weight you're carrying like that, more baggage, let's say, the more of the stress hormone cortisol your brain produces. And cortisol makes you old. Divide your life up into 6 epochs. And then divide each of those, that might be, say, birth to kindergarten, and then maybe elementary school, and then maybe junior high school, however you want to do it. And then to write about the emotionally significant events in each of those epochs, and then to describe their effects on you, and then to analyze how you did in those situations, what you might have done differently, what you might do differently in the future, to straighten out your past.
And you know, people are very, 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 very tough. And it turns out that if you face things that you can put up with a lot more than you think you can put up with, and you can do it without becoming corrupted. And she did recover quite fully, and much as a consequence of her own machinations, because she figured out what was wrong with her and then took the necessary steps to fix it, which is nothing short of a bloody miracle as far as I'm concerned. And anyways, part of the cat bit is, I actually start by talking about our dog, who actually died about a year ago, but he's still alive in the book. I
let people know, because dog lovers love dogs, and if you love cats, then they think you don't like dogs, and then they don't like you. So I also point out at the beginning of the chapter that, you know, if you want to pet a dog on the street, that's okay too, so you don't have to get up in arms about it. But the idea is that, you know, you have to be alert when you're suffering. You have to be alert to the beauty in life, the unexpected beauty in life. And that's kind of what I was trying to get across with the idea of the cat. There's this cat that lives across the street from us called Ginger, and Ginger's a Siamese cat. And cats really aren't domesticated, technically speaking. They're still wild animals, but they kind of like people. God only knows why, but they do, you know. And so Ginger will come wandering over, and our dog looks at her, but they're friends, and she rolls over on his back, and Seiko used to, you know, nose her a bit, and then she'd kind of mosey over and let you pet her if she was feeling like it that day. And, you know, you have to look for those that little bit of sparkling crystal in the darkness when things are bad. You have to look and see where things are still beautiful and where there's still something that's sustaining. And, you know, you narrow your time frame and you be grateful for what you have, and that can get you through some very dark times, and maybe even successfully if you're lucky. But even if unsuccessfully, then maybe it's only tragic and not absolute hell. And you can do that, you know, in the worst situation. You can make it only tragic and not hell. And there's a big gap between tragedy and hell. You know, there's nothing worse at a deathbed than to see the people there fighting. The death is bad enough, but you can take that, as terrible as it is, and make it into something that's absolutely unbearable. And maybe, I think, and this is sort of what I closed the book with, this idea is that if we didn't all attempt to make terrible things even worse than they are, then maybe we could tolerate the terrible things that we have to put up with in order to exist, and maybe we could make the world into a better place, you know. And it's what we should be doing and what we could be doing, because we don't have anything better to do. And that's what the book is about. And something like a general theory of meaning. That's really what I've been working on, I would say, for 35 years, something like a general theory of meaning. And so I'm going to see if I can deliver the whole damn thing in 35 minutes, so which I've never really been able to manage, but I've had a lot of practice, so maybe this is the night. So, okay, so the first thing I want to tell you about is a little bit about how you perceive things, because it's very important to know how you perceive things. And you don't perceive very much, by the way, because, well, there's a lot of the world, way more than you can possibly imagine, and there's not that much of you. And so a lot of information is coming in through a very narrow channel, and it isn't easy, given the fact that all that information exists. It isn't easy to figure out how to narrow that channel so that the information you get is the information that you need. It's information you need that also gives you a grip on the world, right? It has to be practically useful, true and practically useful, something like that. It's a very, 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 very difficult problem to solve. And a lot of it you don't even really solve, because you can't. It's too complicated. You solve it by doing what you're doing right now, for example. So here you are in this unbelievably beautiful building, and I read today a little bit about it, and today it would cost about $1 billion to build this building. And so you're sitting here, and you're all sitting here peacefully, and you're all pointing in the same direction, right? And we're all basically doing the same thing, and we're doing it peacefully, and we can all focus on the same thing, and we had to invest $1 billion for that to be able to happen. And so you think about that, is that part of the way your society solved the problem of the complexity of the world for you was by investing $1 billion in what, how long did it take to construct this place? 15 years, something like that. Maybe it was longer. So that you could sit here in relative comfort and peace and tranquility and concentrate on something that's very focused, maybe something of beauty, something of artistic merit, something of intellectual merit, and that the rest of the world wasn't there, so you didn't have to worry about it. And that's not all. It's not just that you're here in this building and the chairs aren't falling apart and the floor is reliable and the electrical lights work and the sound quality is good and like all the technology is working, and there's people beetling away in the background like mad constantly everywhere, making sure that those impossible things keep happening so that you don't have to be distracted. But then you're also sitting with people who are roughly like you. you know, roughly like you enough so that when they come into a venue like this, they know enough to sit down in the seats and face forward and not turn around and look at the person behind them, which would make them very nervous, right? Which would be an indication that that person isn't playing the same game as everyone else, and so God only knows what they're up to. Because you just wouldn't want that, right? You wouldn't want the guy in front of you turning around and just looking at you for the next 90 minutes. And, well, it's worth thinking about why. Like, well, what are you thinking about? You're going to be sitting there looking like this. Your eyes are going to be darting around, and maybe you're going to be nudging someone and, you know, pointing at this person because maybe they have some idea of what this person is up to, because you don't. And the problem is, if you don't know what that person is up to, then they could be up to anything. And anything is a lot of things to be up to. And you don't want people to be up to anything. You want them to be up to the one or two things they're supposed to be up to while they're with you in this narrow place that you occupy, right? And that's sort of the hallmark of a civilized and socialized person, is when we interact under 90% of conditions, 99% of conditions, you show me your persona. It's just a very narrow slice of yourself, and I show you mine at the bank, say, or you know, at the grocery store, when we pass each other casually in the street. We nod and say hi, and you nod and say hi, or we just walk by peacefully, and like we're seething with complexity, and we don't let any of that out. And the reason for that is we don't want anybody else to let any of it out either. Right? So we keep ourselves simplified, and we build our architecture for that. And so, you know, you come into a building like this, and the building tells you what to do. The chairs are all aligned. The chairs say, sit on me, right? The chairs are all facing the same way in kind of a semicircle, and they say, face the stage. And there's a stage. And so you come in here and all the perceptual problems are solved. And so there's all this technology and there's all this expense, and then there's the shared culture that enables you to know that this is something like a theatrical experience. And so what you do at a theatrical experience is come together as a group and remain silent but attentive, participating in that manner, and watch and listen to the main performance. And you all know that. It's part of the shared culture. And so that shared culture is also enabling you to perceive what you're perceiving right now as a protective mechanism. And that's part of a broader shared sense of civilization, and it's dependent on a shared government. And then there's other forms of protection, you know. I mean, well, the sun isn't shining on us too brutally because we have a roof, and we're not in danger of warfare because you have borders, and you have an armed forces, and you have policemen, and it's like, Christ, there's just things going on around you like mad to ensure that you can sit here so peacefully and so much as if the world isn't a complex place for an hour and a half and do something this focused. And so that's partly how you solve the perceptual problem. You don't see the world that much. You screen a lot of it out. Now, there's a good illustration of this. A psychologist named Dan Simon did this famous experiment which he called Gorillas in Our Midst. And some of you know about it, but I'm going to go over it because it's such a fun experiment to talk about, because it's so ridiculous and so illuminating, and because it's so relevant to what I want to continue talking to you about. So here's the deal. You go into Dan Simon's lab. He was at Harvard 20 years ago when he did this, and he was interested in this phenomena called change blindness. You know, you see those kids' books sometimes where there's picture 1 and picture 2, and you're supposed to look at picture 1 and then look at picture 2 and see what's changed. It's actually hard. You know, you look at picture 1, you say, well, I saw that. And then you look at picture 2, and it's different, but you can't see the differences. And you have to really compare back and forth before you can check out the differences. And that's what perception is like, is you're very blind to change, way more than you think. And way more than anybody thought before Simon did his experiments. And so he did this crazy experiment. So here's the setup. Video camera set up in front of a elevator bank, right? And so the camera would be here, the elevator bank would be about here, so, you know, it's pretty close-up shot. There's 6 people participating, 3 of them dressed in black, 3 of them dressed in white. The white team has a basketball, the black team has a basketball. They fill the whole screen, so it's not like they're way over in the corner this high and you can barely see them. They fill up the whole screen. You can detect their facial figures. It's close shot. You see their whole body, but it's clear. There's no tricks in it. And you sit there and you're the experimental subject, and the psychologist or his assistant says, okay, here's your task. And you're there to be focused on a task, apparently, because you're in a university and you're in a lab and you'd expect to be focused on a task. And so you're already primed for that, and you're willing to go along with it to be obedient. But to be a good sport, let's say, that's better than obedient. And you want to do a good job because it's intimidating to be in a lab like that. And so you want to do a good job of whatever you're supposed to do, unless you're a troublemaker. And you're probably not, because you wouldn't go into the lab to begin with if you were a troublemaker. So Simon says, count the number of times, like the white team is going to throw a basketball back and forth, variety of ways, for 3 minutes. Just count how many times they manage it, and they're going to bounce it and throw it directly and all that. And so the black team and the white team start to mill around on the video, and they're tossing the basketball back and forth, and you're watching the basketball very intently with the central part of your vision. Now, the central part of your vision is very high resolution. And you can tell this. It's pretty easy. I'll show you. I don't know. No, this probably won't work because I think the theater is too big to do it. But we could try it, I guess. So look at my finger. All right, but pay attention to my face. Now, that's hard because usually when you pay attention to something, you look right at it. But I don't want you to do that. I want you to pay attention to my finger and look at my face. And what should happen, except perhaps for those of you who are quite a distance at the back, is that you'll notice that you actually can't see my facial features. So, for example, if I look at even somebody in the third row, if I look directly at you, I can see your facial features fine. I can tell you have glasses. I can't tell if you're male or female. I can't distinguish you from the chair, and it has nothing to do with you. Right. But you don't have to move very far away from central vision before it becomes extremely low resolution. And so that's how your visual system is set up. High resolution in the middle, low resolution as you move towards the periphery, until like out here, I actually can't tell how many, I know how many fingers I have. Well, 5 if you include the thumb, but I can't see them. If I move them, I can see them better. Because that's one of the ways your visual system overcomes its limitations, is that it's better at seeing movement than things that are stable. And that's because, well, if you're watching something and something suddenly moves, off to the right, it might be a good idea for you to shift your attention just to see what it is. And so that's a trick your visual system uses. But mostly it's foveal vision, and it's a very, very small part of your visual field, and it's extremely heavily neurologically innervated in the visual cortex. A lot of cells are devoted to that tiny area in the middle of your vision to make it as high resolution as possible. And it might be nice. Eagles have 2 fovea, by the way. They can see better than human beings. Their eyes, bald eagles, their eyes are as big as human beings, and they can see better than we can. They're the only animals that can do that. They have 2 fovea. But you can't have that high resolution vision across the entire span of your eyes, because then your head would have to be this big to carry that much brain around, and obviously that would be hideous and also counterproductive. So we do the best we can. And what it means is that we're blind to a lot of things that we don't think we're blind to. So anyways, so you're playing Dan Simon's game, and you're counting the number of times that the basketball is tossed back and forth between the white team, and he says how many times, and you say, being a good experimental participant, you say 16. And you're right, and he says you're right, and you think, oh, good, I'm smart enough to participate in a psychological experiment. And you feel good about yourself, It's a little self-respect boost, let's say, because you passed the test. And then Simon says, did you see anything out of the ordinary? And you say, most of you, some people notice, most of you say, no. What do you mean? And Simon says, well, the gorilla. Did you see the gorilla? And you think, well, what do you mean, did I see the gorilla? Like, there was no damn gorilla. I'd see a gorilla, right? If we're watching me on stage and a gorilla came out here, you'd see it. Maybe.
Maybe, as it turns out. It might depend on what the gorilla was doing. But in any case, so Simon rewinds the tape as you watch it, so that there's no tricks, and he says, don't count the balls this time, just watch. So it's a different command, right? So you have a different aim now. You're pursuing a different value structure. He says, just watch. And he rewinds it, and sure enough, you see the gorilla coming out backwards and being in the middle and then going off to the side. And then he replays it for you. And minute and a half into the 3-minute video, in waltzes this damn gorilla. It's a guy, because they didn't have a gorilla for obvious reasons. Ethics committees wouldn't allow them to use a real gorilla. And he's a big guy. He's not a small chimpanzee-type ape. He's 6'4", and he saunters out there and beats his chest like for 4 seconds, right in the middle of the screen, which you might think you'd see since it's right in the middle of the screen, and then he saunters off to the side, and you don't see it. And the question is, well, what the hell's wrong with you? Like, why don't you see it? And it's worse than that. Like, Simon has done other funny tricks. Like, imagine you went to a grocery store and the cashier was behind the counter, right? And you're talking to the cashier, and the cashier says, excuse me for a minute, and then kneels down, and then someone else stands up and keeps talking to you. And you think, oh, you're going to catch that. And you don't. About 50% of people miss that completely. So you can like change the person completely. And the reason is, well, how much processing do you have to do to have a casual interaction with a cashier at a grocery store? And the answer is, not much, right? You don't have to do the processing doesn't have to be that deep. And you can kind of tell this because you can watch The Simpsons, or you can watch South Park, and South Park has like the world's worst animation, right? I mean, everything moves like this. It's all circles and triangles, and you don't care. It's like 5 minutes into the narrative. It doesn't matter that it's circles and triangles having a conversation. It's fine. The icon will work. And that's a good rule for perception, is you use the simplest possible perceptual scheme that you can manage to get yourself from point A to point B, right? It's a map. You don't see the world. You see an iconic representation of the world. And then the question is, what makes the iconic representation sufficient? And I suppose sufficient means a couple of things. One thing it means is tolerable, right? It doesn't cause an excess of suffering and degeneration. It has to be functional, right? And then maybe a more specific example of that would be, well, it has to work, like a map works. A map is a low-resolution representation, but it's a good enough map if you use the map and you start at point A and you happen to be at point A, which is a good beginning for a map, and then you use the map and you get to point B and you think, good enough map. And that's really, that's us. That's how we think. That's how we construe the world. Our maps are really, the stories that we use in the world are really the maps we use to guide us. And they have perceptual implications. But that's essentially what you do. So now the question is, all right, what happened in the gorilla video? Well, what happened was you were aiming at something, right? You're aiming at counting the passes. And the question is, well, why were you doing that? And the answer is, well, someone told you to, asked you to. And then you might ask, well, why did you listen to them? There's lots of other things you might have done in the lab, but that isn't what you did. You did what you were asked to. And we might say, well, that's because you're reasonably cooperative and civilized. And then we might say, well, why is that a hallmark of cooperation and civilization? And we might say, well, reciprocity, like spontaneous reciprocity between strangers who have a bit of a contractual arrangement is part of civilized behavior, and so that's the appropriate thing to do. And we might say, well, you wanted to do a good job in the lab because you wanted to make sure that your status wasn't too low. You know, you could count to 16, and so you can give yourself a pat on the back of the head for that. And, you know, it's part of being a civilized person. And so there's a huge value structure behind that. Like, you didn't go into the lab and shoot it up, you know? You didn't bring a hand grenade, right? And you didn't sexually assault the experimenter. There's lots of things you could have done in there. And you didn't do those things. You just sat there and counted the balls and missed the gorilla. Okay, so, and there's complicated reasons for that. There are deep reasons for that.
And so there are deep reasons for how you perceive things and why.
Life has proximal meanings, right? There's the meaning that you experience when you're engaged in a piece of art, or when you're reading, or when you're engrossed in a movie or in a conversation. There's the meaning that emerges within your relationships with people that you cherish or are enthusiastic with. There's meanings of security and predictability. There's meanings of duty and responsibility and active engagement with your job and your career. There's meanings of aesthetic pleasure. Now, all of those have their value, and each of them has their place. And maybe there's a hierarchy of value there as well, so that some of those meanings are deeper than others. And then you might say, well, what characterized the deepest of all meanings? And it would be something like relationship with the transcendent, and that would establish a relationship between you and what's always been conceptualized as God, which is generally supposed to be something ineffable, right? It's not definable, but you might think about it as the central animating spirit of the age, or the value around which all other values are organized, or the wisdom of the ages, or the creative spirit that possesses you when you're inspired, or what grips you with enthusiasm at a sports event or at a musical event. All of those things. And we need a relationship with that. And we find our deepest meaning in that relationship. And if we don't find it, I think if we don't find it in something that's explicitly religious, then we tend to magnify something of lesser value, say something political, into that to fill the void. So yes, life has proximal meanings without God, without eternity, but at the ultimate level, something's lacking. And it's the desire to fulfill that lack that, and maybe the lack itself, that's part and parcel of the religious instinct. So you can kill God, but you can't. That doesn't rectify the hunger for God. And then that hunger seeks out replacements. That's how it looks to me. So, and then, you might also say, well, does that mean you have to believe in God? And I don't think of the proper answer to that is that you need to agree with a propositional statement. Does God exist? Yes. Like, is this table there? Yes. It's not that kind of relationship. I mean, it's characterized in the Old Testament as a struggle. So Israel means those who struggle with God. And you have to participate in that struggle. And you can do that, weirdly enough, as a believer or as a non-believer. Maybe sometimes more intensely as a non-believer. The issue might be more paramount then, the issue of virtue and the issue of the ultimate orientation. If you're plagued by bouts of depression and anxiety, that does destabilize your identity. So it's almost by definition. But having said that, look, this is when habit and plan and strategy are so useful. So in the periods of depression that I've had, and some of them were long and certainly the most unpleasant experiences of my life. This is when you need a philosophy, let's say, that's allied with your vision and your strategy to sustain you. Because what would happen to me is that, I have a vision, and I suppose the vision is of a world that's better, that's less likely to descend into ideological catastrophe, and where people are more responsible and more awake and more educated and healthier. All of that, a vision of a better world, a world that's less hellish at least, but also a better world, and some sense of what role I might play in that. And so that's very motivating. Like, it's a profound goal to try to make things better. And you can do that locally. You can do that for yourself. You can do that for your family. You can do that for the broader community. And all of that's worth it, man. It's worth making some sacrifices for. It's worth suffering for to some degree. And then you decompose that into the day-to-day and week-to-week strategies and actions that you're undertaking, the plans and the activities that you're putting forward to make that dream a reality, to realize it. And then when the depression and anxiety come along, you think, part of it with depression, it's just bloody endurance. It's like you get up and you work through the next hour, you try to stay on track, you try to implement your strategic plans to the best of your ability, and you hope and you pray that you'll get through it. You know, you'll get through it and that the darkness will recede, and you stay on track. You eat even though you're not hungry. You get up even though you want to stay in bed. You interact with people even though you'd rather be alone. And it's the benefit of disciplined habits can sustain you. It's like the boat you're rowing in through a terrible storm, leaks and all, and maybe you'll be overwhelmed, but you have the boat and you can row forward, and that's what you've got.
Okay, well, so that's another issue in some sense that seems to make the postmodernist critique even more correct. How in the world are you going to extract out a canonical interpretation of something like that? It's like it's not possible. But here's the issue, as far as I can tell. So when the postmodernists extended that critique to the world, they said, look, well, a text is complicated enough. You can't extract out a canonical interpretation. What about the world? The world's way more complicated than a text, and so there's an infinite number of ways that you can look at the world. And so how do we know that any one way is better than any other way? And that's a good question. Now, the postmodern answer was we can't. And that's not a good answer, because you drown in chaos under those circumstances, right? You can't make sense of anything. And that's not good, because it's not neutral to not make sense of things. It's very anxiety-provoking. It's very depressing, because if things are so chaotic that you can't get a handle on them, your body defaults into emergency preparation mode, and your heart rate goes up and your immune system stops working, and like you burn yourself out. You age rapidly because you're surrounded by nothing you can control. That's an existential crisis, right? It's anxiety-provoking and depressing, very hard on people. And even more than that, it turns out that the way that we're constructed neurophysiologically is that we don't experience any positive emotion unless we have an aim and we can see ourselves progressing towards that aim. It isn't precisely attaining the aim that makes us happy, as you all know if you've ever attained anything, because as soon as you attain it, then the whole little game ends. Then you have to come up with another game, right? So it's Sisyphus. And that's okay, but it does show that the attainment can't be the thing that drives you, because it collapses the game. That's what happens when you graduate from university. It's like you're king of the mountain for one day, and then you're like surf at Starbucks for the next 5 years, you know? So, yeah. So what happens is that human beings are weird creatures, because we're much more activated by having an aim and moving towards it than we are by attainment. And what that means is you have to have an aim, and that means you have to have an interpretation. And it also means that the nobler the aim, that's one way of thinking about it, the better your life. And that's a really interesting thing to know, because, you know, you've heard ever since you were tiny that you should act like a good person, and you shouldn't lie, for example. And you might think, well, why the hell should I act like a good person, and why not lie? I mean, even a 3-year-old can ask that question, because smart kids learn to lie earlier, by the way. And they think, well, why not twist the fabric of reality so that it serves your specific short-term needs? I mean, that's a great question. Why not do that? Why act morally? If you can get away with something, and it brings you closer to something you want, well, why not do it? These are good questions. It's not self-evident. Well, it seems to me tied in with what I just mentioned. It's like, you destabilize yourself and things become chaotic. That's not good. And if you don't have a noble aim, then you have nothing but shallow, trivial pleasures, and they don't sustain you. And that's not good, because life is so difficult, it's so much suffering, it's so complex. It ends, and everyone dies, and it's painful. It's like, without a noble aim, how can you withstand any of that? You can't. You become desperate, and once you become desperate, things go from bad to worse very rapidly when you become desperate. And so there's the idea of the noble aim. And it's not something, it's something that's necessary. It's the bread that people cannot live without, right? That's not physical bread. It's the noble aim. And what is that? Well, it was encapsulated in part in the story of Marduk. It's to pay attention. It's to speak properly. It's to confront chaos. It's to make a better world. It's something like that. And that's enough of a noble aim so that you can stand up without, cringing at the very thought of your own existence, so that you can do something that's worthwhile to justify your wretched position on the planet. So now the literary issue is that, so look, you take a text, you can interpret it a variety of ways, but that's not right. This is where the postmodernists went wrong, because what you're looking for in a text, and in the world for that matter, is sufficient order and direction. So then we have to think, well, what does sufficient order and direction means? Well, you don't want to suffer so much that your life is unbearable, right? That just seems self-evident. Pain argues for itself. I think of pain as the fundamental reality because no one disputes it, right? I mean, even if you say that you don't believe in pain, it doesn't help when you're in pain. You still believe in it, right? You can't pry it up with logic and rationality. It just stands forth as what the fundament of existence, and that's actually quite useful to know. Say, well, you don't want any more of that than is absolutely necessary. And I think that's self-evident. And then you say, well, wait a minute, it's more complicated than that. You don't want any more of that that's necessary today, but also not tomorrow, and not next week, and not next month, and not next year. So however you act now, better not compromise how you're going to be in a year, because that would just be counterproductive. That's part of the problem with short-term pleasures, right? It's like act in haste, repent at leisure. Everyone knows exactly what that means. So you have to act in a way that works now and tomorrow and next week and next month and so forth. And so you have to take your future self into account. And human beings can do that. And taking your future self into account isn't much different than taking other people into account, right? Because I remember there's this Simpson episode, and Homer downs a quart of mayonnaise and vodka. And he says, Marge says, you shouldn't really do that. And Homer says, that's a problem for future Homer. I'm sure glad I'm not that guy.
So I was talking to a client the other day. It was so interesting. This person said something. He had been talking to his mother, and he just made a casual comment. He said he was talking to his mother, who was in a state of grief for good reasons that were independent of this particular person, who said, and I hate her. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Like, where did that come from? And so I made a comment on that. That's a Freudian slip, right? Because the conversation was flowing, and then this little emotion-tagged utterance came forward. And whenever an emotion-tagged utterance of that sort comes forward, it's associated with a whole rat's nest of underlying pain and anxiety and what would you call it, disappointment and frustration that hasn't been properly rectified. So it's like a marker. And you know this when you're talking to people. They say something and you think, oh, like, wow, too much information. That's one way of thinking about it. It's like, just what are you up to? And then if you have any sense, you just forget that even happened and you continue. But that's like the snout of a dragon peeking out from a cave. And you might say, well, it's just a snout, man. But it's not, because dragon snouts tend to be attached to the whole damn dragon. And so this is also something to know about relationships, because when you're in a relationship with someone, they'll do that now and then. They'll utter something and you think, haha, it's like, there's a bump in the road. Well, we're going to look underneath that at our peril. But if you do go down there and you look at it, then the whole thing comes, you can start to disentangle the web of memories and experiences that are all tangled together as a consequence of their emotional identity. Because I could say, well, everything that makes you anxious or everything that makes you upset is the same as every other thing that's ever made you upset. And then there's an even different subset of that, which is all those things that have made you upset that you've never dealt with. They're all laying down there at the bottom of your nasty little soul, waiting to pop themselves up in some random utterance, right? And so then you go in there at your peril, because if you're the person who pokes around in that, then you're going to get blasted with all of that stuff. It's going to come out like almost uncontrollably.
then you can sort it out. And so what you find is if you ask a person a question like that and then you let them free associate, which is just talk about it, they'll do a wandering around like that maze that I told you about. They'll do a wandering around of that entire territory. And sometimes just having them wander around in it can help them straighten it out. But you might find out that something happened to them 15 years ago that left them with a terrible sense of guilt or dismay or frustration. And then when they interact with their parent in a certain way, the parent knows exactly how to tap that, and then that all comes up, and that's what produces that little utterance. And so that's the material of the world manifesting itself. That's what matters manifesting itself. And it almost always manifests itself as an object, something that objects. We're having a conversation. It's going quite well, no problem. There's a bump in it. There's an emotional disjunct, right? Now we're no longer in the same place at the same time. We're no longer playing the same game. So then I might say, okay, well, let's open that up and see what's behind it. Well, and the question is, what's behind the game you're playing? And the answer to that is all the world that you're ignoring, always. So when imagine that, think about it this way. You're trying to do well in a class and you get a bad grade. Okay, so you're in this little frame, you want to get a good grade, that isn't happening, you got a bad grade. Okay, what is it that's manifesting itself as the bad grade? Well, you could say, well, it's a C- on a piece of paper. It's like, well, that's, really? No. That's the objective manifestation. You got a piece of paper with a C-. The value-free proposition is that you've been delivered a piece of paper with a curve on it and a little, negative sign. Well, you think, well, that's what that is. Well, it's as dopey as thinking, well, here you got your failing grade, you go into the lab and you weigh it on a scale, and then you burn it and see what it was made of. It's like, well, why did I get so upset about that? It's just paper. It's like, no, that's not just paper. It's an entity that exists in a web of connections. The fact that it's signified by paper is almost completely irrelevant. What is it? The answer is, you don't know. And that's why when you pick it up, you get this paralyzed sinking feeling, because your limbic system is a lot smarter than your perceptual systems. And your perceptual systems say, well, that's a piece of paper, and your limbic system says, nah, for sure, dragon. Right. And so then you're sweating, and then maybe you put it away and you go play video games because, better the hypothetical dragon than the real dragon. And so instead you pull out the piece of paper maybe and you think, okay, why did I get this C-? Well, that's a hell of a question, isn't it? It's like, maybe you're stupid. Well, that could be, or at least stupid compared to who you think you are. Like that's the real horror that's lurking there, right? It's like, oh, I thought I was kind of smart. That's a proposition of the highest order. I thought I was kind of smart. It's like, yeah, well, what about this C-? It's like, well, that goddamn professor, right? That's the first thing. I've been attacked by a predator. That's the first response, right? So it's a nonsensical message. It's just delivered by someone evil and predatory. Well, that's, possible, but I wouldn't go there. I wouldn't go there first necessarily. So, but then, well, then say you don't go there. Okay, well, so what is this exactly? Do you not know what you thought you knew? Are you not who you think you are? Do you not work hard enough? Are your values not organized properly? Do you misuse your time? Are you in the wrong field? Is the way you're construing your life completely inappropriate? Are you acting out what your parents wanted you to do and you're pissed off about it, so you're only running at 40% to spite them, despite the fact that they're paying $25,000 a year for your education? Because that's a fun game. Yeah, I'll go do what you want me to do, but I'll fail. But not completely, because then that wouldn't cost you very much. I'll just fail a little bit, so that you have to spend all that money forcing me to do what I don't want to do, but you'll never get to escape from it. And then every time we interact, I'll stab you in various ways that you don't quite understand, just to show you how irritated I am that I happen to be acting out the destiny that you've put forward for me. So maybe that's part of the dragon, right? And then that pulls in the whole parent thing. And these are bottomless pits often. When you're in the world and something objects to you, something that matters objects to you, then in the entire unrealized world is in that thing that objects. It's all tangled up inside it. That's why it's the great dragon of chaos. It's everything that's outside of your conceptual structure. And what is that? It's everything that lurks outside of your walled city. And it's manifested itself like the snake in the garden. And the easiest thing to do is say, I'm not having anything to do with that. But the problem with that is, well, you get your C- and you don't do anything about it. Maybe you're a little bitter and more resentful, and your study habits get a little worse. So the next time you get like a D+, and then you collect a bunch of Fs, and then you stop going to school, and then you stop showering, right? Then you end up jumping off the bridge. And so that's how the dragon eats you when you don't pay attention to it. And so it's no bloody wonder that people avoid, you know. It's really no wonder that they avoid, because error messages contain within them the implicit world. Now the upside of that is, well, they contain within them the implicit world, and the world isn't all negative. And so maybe you get your C-, and that's actually the best gift you ever got, because somebody finally took you and went whack, you know, clue in. And so you take that apart and you think, oh, I don't know how to write, I don't know how to think, I've never read anything in my life, my study habits are abysmal, you know, like maybe I'm working at 2% efficiency, which is probably, I would suspect that, you know, some of you aren't doing that, but I bet there's 30 to 50% of the people in the room are working at 2% efficiency. It's like, you gotta, to find that out is so optimistic. I mean, if you're barely hanging in there, but you're only working at 2%, you might imagine what you could have as a life if you're working at like 50%. So the C- can be the best gift you ever had, and that's the gold that the dragon hoards, right? That's exactly what that means. It's with our fantasy that we first meet the unknown, right? Well, look, say you're going out with a new person. It's like, what do? You project a fantasy on them, and then you fall in love with the fantasy. And aren't you stupid? Because you're going to find out that the match between your damn fantasy and the actual person is tenuous at best. And so Jung would call that a projection of either the anima or the animus. You know, the anima is what a man projects onto a woman he finds desirable. It's like, oh, she's the perfect woman. It's like, well, how do you know that? You've like seen her for 4 seconds, you know, but it grips you. And the same thing happens in the opposite direction. And it's an action of instinct, you know. It's like you fall in love with the image. But interestingly enough, what you do in a relationship that works is that you actually, I think that what you see, it's a rough approximation, when you project the ideal and fall in love with it, you see what could be. It could be that, but it's going to take you a hell of a lot of work, because like you got no shortage of flaws, and the other person has no shortage of flaws, and so you're bringing your flaws together, and that's going to produce a lot of friction, and you're going to have to engage in a lot of dialogue before you approach that level of perfection again. But maybe you can do it, and then you get to live happily ever after. Well, wouldn't that be nice? Well, so the unconscious meets the unknown, and it meets it with imagination and fantasy and dream and art. That's how you take, see, you don't just go from what you don't know to fully articulated knowledge in one bloody leap. You can't do that. You have to extend pseudopods of fantasy and imagination into the unknown. That's kind of what theorizing is like, right? Even scientifically, you know, you don't know something scientifically, you generate a theory. Well, it's an imaginative representation that your unconscious is helping you generate. And so you meet the unknown with fantasy. That's what the unconscious is for. From the psychoanalytic perspective, that's what dreams do. And you can see why. You dream about the future. You know, it's like, well, what's the future going to be like? Well, you have a little imaginative story going on, and it's like, you don't really create it. It's sort of, you watch it unfold. You know, maybe you can tweak it here and there, but it sort of comes to you from wherever the hell things like that come from. You know, the unconscious, that's the psychoanalytic answer. It's not really much of an answer, because it's more like a representation of a place that we don't understand. But that's where creativity comes from. And I mean, some people are really creative right down to the bloody core. So in my clinical practice, I often see people who are high in openness because they're attracted to me because they watch my lectures. And you have to kind of be high in openness to like my lectures. So because, well, you do, because they go everywhere, you know, and they're not necessarily very orderly. So anyways, lots of my clients are really high in openness, and they're funny people often, especially if they're smart, because sometimes they have the most nihilistic intelligence you can imagine. It's just self-critical and nihilistic and brutally brutal, man, and smart. And so they just criticize themselves out of existence. And so often I have to just try to get them to quit listening to their chattering self-critical rationality and go out and create something, you know, with their massive creativity. And as long as they're doing that, they're engaged in the world and happy as hell. But as soon as that self-critical rationality comes in and shuts down the creativity, they're just like walking corpses, you know. And it's because if you're really open, like you're a tree and it has some trunks, and you know, your most prominent trait is the most lively trunk. And if you're a creative person and you're not engaging in a creative enterprise, you're like a tree that has had its vitality amputated. And so this is not trivial. This is deeply, deeply, deeply rooted in your biology. And those are people often who have like dream lives you just can't believe. I have one client, he has like 4 spectacular dreams a week, and most of the time we just spend discussing them. I mean, God. And I had another client who could be lucid in her dreams, which is more common among women. She could ask the damn characters what they represented and they would tell her. It was like, okay, that was pretty weird. And like a lot of the things they told her were really helpful, and they were not things that she wanted to hear. She basically, one of them told her if she was going to live, she'd have to go visit a slaughterhouse. And the reason for that was because she was raised as a little princess and protected from horrible Mother Nature until she hit puberty, in which time she turned into an evil villain, because that's how the family worked. Perfect child, evil teenager, overnight. And then, well, that was hard on her, and she wasn't prepared because she thought the world was princess world, and you know, she couldn't go through a butcher store without having a fit. And no wonder, you know, like really, Jesus, you know, it's no wonder, but you do it. But she couldn't, so we used to go to butcher stores, and that would make her cry, and that she was a vegetarian, that would make her cry, and you know, bemoan the cruelty of the world. And it's like, yeah, fair enough, man, those are bloody slabs of meat. It's like, I don't know why everyone isn't screaming when they walk through the butcher store, but you got to get used to it, man, because you can't live in the world otherwise. And so the dream character, who was a gypsy, told her that she had to go visit a slaughterhouse, which seemed rather impractical. And so I asked her if she could think of anything else to do, and she thought, well, why don't we go visit a funeral home and watch an embalming? And I thought, oh, good, that sounds like a fun way to spend a day. And so I phoned up a funeral parlor, and I said I had a client who was terrified of death. Yeah, and I was a therapist who was also a little shaky on the concept myself. And so they had no problem with that. They deal with death all the time, which is really something to think about, right? A human being can actually have an occupation where they do nothing but deal with death, and they don't go stark raving mad. It's like, what the hell's up with that? It's like working in a palliative care ward where your clients that you know have a relationship, all they're going to do is die this week, next week, the week after. People do that. It's like, those people are tough, man. They're tough. So anyways, we went and watched this embalming, which was, I have a rather high level of disgust sensitivity, so it was a little on the rough side for me. But she sat there, and first while she was not, we were outside this little room, she was not looking at that, man, no way. Then she'd kind of go like this, and you know, that was pretty good. And then she'd go like this, and then she'd go like this, and then she watched it. And then she asked if she could go in, and she put on a glove and she touched the body, and she didn't have a fit, she didn't have a panic attack. And so she walked away from there learning that there was a hell of a lot more to her than she thought there was, and that she could see things that she didn't think she could see and live. And after that, she sort of had a touchstone. It's like, well, I'm kind of afraid of this. Well, is it as bad as going to see the embalming? No, it's not that bad. Well, I guess I can do it. It's like an initiation, right? She had an initiation. And so did I, you know. And I learned a lot from doing that. I learned that one of the things you need to do if you're going to be a human being is to prepare yourself to be useful in the face of death. And so when you have a parent that dies, which, you know, shatters people's ideas, often they can't even think about it. If you can't even think about that, man, you've got some thinking to do. Because you need to be able to at least think about that, because otherwise you're just going to be a wasteland when it happens. And you never know, you could even have a higher ambition. Maybe you could even be useful when it happens, instead of being part of the heap of destroyed people who also have to be taken care of. You know, and that's brutal. You have to be brutal to be useful in the aftermath of your parents' death. You know, you don't get to crumble and fall apart, and no, you have every reason to. So you got to be kind of some tough monster to manage that. But do you want to be useful in the face of tragedy, or do you want to be pathetic? So imagine you have a goal in mind. You want to get to work in the morning. I used to ask my students a question like this, is like, what? Maybe they're going to write an essay. Why are you writing the essay? Why are you in class? Well, I'm in class because I need this class because it's part of my major. Well, why did you pick a major like that? Well, I'm interested in psychology. Well, why did you come to get a degree? Well, I think I need a degree to get a job. Well, why do you need a job? Well, I need a job to keep body and soul together, and maybe to be productive, and maybe to, you know, establish a name for myself. And why do you want to do that? Well, because, you know, it's part and parcel of living properly. And why do you want to live properly? And well, then, and how would you live if you lived properly? And at that point, people are usually unable to answer. You know, because you can just push people with questions about why until they run out of explanations. But the point is that you're always doing whatever you're doing because what you're doing is nested in a sequence of goal-directed actions. And those can be more or less sophisticated. If you're not very sophisticated at all, the nesting might be like 2 structures deep. You know, maybe you're, I don't know, you're bored and you want to go get drunk, you know, and why? Well, because you don't want to be bored, and if someone pushes you a little farther than that, you hit them, and you know you don't want to delve into it. But if you're sophisticated, you have a pretty good hierarchy of answers. So you might say, well, why do you want to be a productive and generous citizen? And like I said, people usually bottom out there, but you could say, well, that's part of reciprocal altruism, and if I'm productive and generous, then that'll encourage other people to be productive and generous, and if we're all productive and generous together, then there'll be more for everyone, and we'll all get along better, and we'll get along for a longer period of time, and that'll make us all more stable, and that'll make our societies better. And then you might say, well, why is that relevant? You might say, well, because the alternative to that is something like a descent into something approximating hell, and so that's part of a reflection of the divine order and the eternal battle between good and evil. And then you could push it farther than that, and you could say, well, are you going to be on the side of the redemptive hero, or are you going to be on the side of the eternal adversary? Like, you can keep digging down farther and farther, and the farther down you dig, the more you get down into what you might describe as the implicit religious substrate. And it's very much useful to know that and to make as much of that conscious as possible. So now imagine that you've come to this talk tonight because you've decided to aim up. And maybe you haven't formulated that precisely explicitly, but something is driving you in this direction. And then you come to the talk and you find out that I'm talking about something that isn't what you expected, and it doesn't seem to be moving you along on your pathway forward to that end. And what's going to happen is you're going to be disappointed. And you might be anxious too. You're going to be disappointed because disappointment signals that you're experiencing something that's not relevant to the goal that you are attempting to pursue, and that might in fact be interfering with it. That's what negative emotion does. And maybe if you're disappointed in what I say, that also makes you anxious because you assumed that you would come here and I would say something relevant, because you assumed that you knew who I was, and then it turned out that I didn't, and then you don't know who I am, and then you don't know what you're doing here, and then you get anxious. And the reason you get anxious is because that's what anxiety is for. It tells you when the pathway to your goal has been disrupted. So multiple pathways have now emerged. So imagine you're driving your car to work and it quits. And what happens is you get anxious. And the reason you get anxious is because, well, you were beetling along quite nicely in your world, and everything was reduced to like a unidimensional simplicity. You weren't in a car as an object, you were in a thing that took you to where you wanted to go, and it was just doing what it was supposed to be doing. tracking you along the pathway to your goal. And then it fails and you're off on the side of the road and you get anxious because how the hell are you going to get to work? And what if you don't get to work? And is your boss not going to be very happy with you? And maybe this is the third mistake you've made this week. And what if you get fired? And weren't you an idiot for buying this car? Maybe you shouldn't have a car at all. Maybe you should have walked to work. And, you know, maybe you should take a bicycle because after all, that would save the planet. And, you know, and maybe now you have to take your car to a mechanic. But the last time you went to the mechanic, you got ripped off because you're too stupid about vehicles to manage one, and you're kind of stupid about technology in general. And aren't you stupid? And maybe you're too stupid, and isn't your wife going to? That's anxiety, right? And that's the emergence of a multiplicity of pathways, right? And so what anxiety signifies is the degeneration of an attentional hierarchy into multiplicity. And the reason you get anxious and it feels bad is because now your body can't compute how much energy you have to put out in order to get to your goal. And so you can't organize the world. You're apt to use more resources than you'll replenish. And if you continue to do that, then you'll die. And so anxiety is a signal that complexity has reemerged, chaos. That's the eternal dragon of chaos. Chaos has reemerged because your narrative has collapsed. And so that's negative emotion. That's what negative emotion signifies, is that it's the collapse of an organizing narrative. And so that's very interesting to know. So you feel positive. If I walk on the stage and I know I'm supposed to go to the front of the stage, say, and the reason I want to do that is because I know I have to talk to you, and that's and I want to talk to you because I think it's valuable to talk to you, etc. That's nested in a hierarchy of value. And if I see a clear pathway to the front of the stage, then that actually produces positive emotion. And that positive emotion impels me forward, because positive emotion does impel you forward. That's what it's for. That's how positive emotion is linked to action. So if you're enthusiastic because you can see a pathway forward to a valued goal, and that enthusiasm manifests itself. This is true even neurochemically. It manifests itself as positive motivation to move forward. And not only that, if you're moving forward and it's working, your brain tracks the fact that it's working, and then that's linked to dopamine release, by the way, which is what cocaine releases. It's linked to dopamine release. And the other thing your brain is doing, even when you're just walking to where you want to go, if you're successfully walking there, your brain tracks what you're doing. There's circuits that are activated while you're doing it. And if what you're doing results in the result you desired, then the dopamine floods those little neurons that are active, and it makes them grow and flourish. And so as you practice something that's working, the circuit that is activated as you're practicing is bathed in dopamine, and that makes it stronger. And that feels good. It's growth. It's part of positive emotion. And so the positive emotion moves you forward, but also encourages you to develop a habit of that practice. And so one of the things I would bloody well say is, don't make a habit of pursuing things that aren't good for you, because you build that into you. That's what happens if you become addicted to something, you know. You build a little monster inside you that's grown. It's there. It's after one goal, despite everything else. Not a good outcome. So now positive emotion also signals the fact that it's also an energy conservation observation. So as I move forward towards my goal, with each step I take, it's going to take less energy to get to the goal. And so that means that the positive emotion signifies, what would you say? It signifies the increasing efficiency of your action as you move towards a goal. So negative emotion signifies the fact that things have got too complex for you to manage, and positive emotion signifies that you're approaching your goal and that there's less demand on energy output with every step forward. And so that's emotion. And that's pretty much worth knowing. And then what happens when you're watching a movie is you infer the goal of the protagonist, or the villain for that matter. You infer the goal of the character that's being portrayed on the screen. You adopt that goal as your own. Then you play out the emotions in your own body, which mimics the structure what would you call the character that's being portrayed on the screen, and you live that all out inside you. And that's also how you understand other people. Right? You don't listen to someone and then figure out what they're saying and then infer what they're thinking. That isn't how it works. What you do is you listen to someone till you figure out what they're up to. As soon as you figure out what they're up to, you can adopt that frame of reference. As soon as you adopt that frame of reference, you have the same emotions. And that's what makes you united. And so that's so interesting. And so then you think, look, there's 5,000 people in here. If there were 5,000 chimpanzees, you guys would be tearing each other into shreds, because no one would be able to know what anyone else was up to. But because all of you are here paying attention to the same thing in the same way, you have virtually identical emotional states, and that means instantly your behavior is rendered predictable to one another. And there's no difference between that and peace. They're the same thing. And so what that means is that one of the predicates of a civil, productive, and peaceful society is that everyone inhabits the same narrative. And you might say, well, we don't need the same narrative. It's like, yes, we do, because if we inhabit a different narrative, then we're running emotionally in different directions, and we will not understand each other, and we will run into conflict, and that conflict can become deadly at the drop of a hat. And so it's a precondition for a civil society that everyone is united in the same narrative. And then that begs the question, right? What is the narrative insofar as we're unified? And another question, which is, what should the narrative be? Right? Now, the postmodernists figured out that we looked at the world through a story, but they said their mantra is they became skeptical of meta-narratives, which are uniting narratives. And that's all well and good to be skeptical about meta-narratives, but you run into the problem of internal disunion, because if you don't have a uniting narrative, then you're divided against yourself, and you run into the problem of social disunity, because if we're not looking at the same thing for the same reason, then we can't get along. And those are big problems. Now, the way the postmodernists glided over that immense cataclysmic problem was to offer the proposition that the narrative that unites us is just one of power and oppression, right? And that the fundamental motivation that guides, first of all, even your internal organization, your own internal tyranny, you're oppressing your id or your natural self. And then if you establish a relationship with someone like a marriage, well, that's just a manifestation of patriarchal oppression. And if you organize a business relationship, it's a relationship of mutual exploitation, and so far and so on, all the way up the political hierarchy, all the way back into the past. A more dismal view of human existence couldn't possibly be formulated. And I always think about it as a kind of implicit confession. It's like, so you think the world's all run by power, do you? Okay, I know what game you're playing and attempting to justify, and it's completely bloody preposterous, because first of all, if you tyrannize yourself, you're going to be one miserable creature. Plus, you're going to rebel constantly, as you already know. I'm sure all of you have tried at one time or another in your life to force yourself to do something with a whip, so to speak, and what you instantly find is that you're so condemned to be free that you'll even resist your own tyranny, right? Try telling yourself to do something and see if you do it. I'm going to go to the gym. That's New Year's. I'm going to the gym 3 times a week, 2 hours a day. It's like, no, you're not. You're going to last like 3 days. And then you're going to find an excuse. The rebellious part of you is going to find an excuse, then you're not going to do it. And it's a bloody mystery, isn't it? Because you'd think you could tell yourself what to do. Because otherwise, who are you? You're the part that told yourself what to do, but you don't listen, so what the hell's that part? That's you, that's for sure. So you can't even tyrannize yourself with any efficiency. And then if you're married, men, you're married, try tyrannizing your wife and see how well that works. And like, it might work for 10 minutes, but she's not as big as you, but she's a lot sneakier. And so And you have to wake up with her tomorrow morning. And so even if you do win the fight, which you won't, she's going to bloody well take it out on you the next day, and no wonder. And so you're bound in that relationship by the necessity of continual iterative interactions, right? And they have to be moderately peaceful, or you're going to tear each other into shreds. And if it's constant conflict, you're both going to just exhaust yourself and die. So how the hell is that going to work? So it has to be at least mutually reinforcing. And maybe if you really got it together well, you could interact with each other in a way that improved your interactions across time. And maybe you're wise enough so that if you were on that track, the way you would experience that in the moment would be as exactly the kind of relationship you'd want to have with someone. And that would be something like the spirit of play and romantic love. And that would be the manifestation of an instinct that orients you across time properly in a relationship in the moment. And that's such a wonderful thing to know, right? That instinct for play and romantic love might be the voice of the wisest instinct you have, the deepest orientation to meaning that you have. You know, because there's nothing more delightful in a marriage or in a family, if you have children, than to be able to engage in something like voluntary play. And you know, if you could have the world set up the way you would want it to, if you had any sense, wouldn't it be something if mostly what you did was something akin to play? And that's equivalent. Christ in the gospel says, know that unless you become like a little child, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. And what does that mean? It means to rediscover that intense immersion in life and that capacity for play that characterized us all as children, that we can't maintain because we have to mature, but that we could rediscover as adults if we were sufficiently wise and careful. And so, and then, you know, if you have friends, it's like, well, you tyrannize your friends? Well, then you don't have friends. You're just a bully with henchmen. And as soon as you stumble, they're going to stab you in the back because you surrounded yourself with craven psychopaths. They're just going to wait for the moment to take you out. That's not a friendship, obviously. And if you're running a business, and those of you who've run businesses who have a clue know this is true, it's like, what happens if you rip off your customers? Well, you can get away with it once or twice, but word gets around in no time flat, and then you're just done and bitter and resentful because your idiot machinations didn't work. But if you engage in fair trade and you're reliable and you deliver what you promised and you're half decently good to your employees and the people that you work for, then they're going to be pleased with you, and they're going to come back and they're going to talk to their friends about how well you did, and you're going to flourish. And none of that's arbitrary. You know, that's all guided by the manifestation of a certain form of attentional priority, right? You go to your customer's house, maybe you're a plumber, and the first thing you do is you listen to their damn problem. And so at least you have enough sense to engage in dialogos, right? You actually want to hear what the problem is, and then you actually want to solve it. And if you do that with some diligence, they're going to be pleased with you because they don't want sewage all over the rug. And so your interests are aligned, and if you offer what you promise, then you're going to evoke positive emotion in them and quell their anxiety, and that's exactly the service that you're offering. And so that means you're acting out the proper story, you're productive and generous and honest, and there's nothing arbitrary about that as a ethos that unites you internally and that also makes it possible for you to exist in a peaceful and productive society.
And so this is a good thing for people to know. If something bothers you, there's a billion things that could bother you, and not everything does. And so then you might ask, well, why does that thing bother you when some other thing that's equally bad doesn't? And as far as I can tell, the answer to that is because if it bothers you, that's your problem. And you might think, I don't want to have a problem. It's like, that's because you don't know that problems and opportunities are the same thing. So if a problem's crying out to you, then it could well be that your proper destiny is to address that problem, in which case it's an immense opportunity. And you saw that, exactly that. Oh, look, there's an absence in the marketplace. Well, that's a good discovery, an absence in the marketplace, especially if you're right. And so that's what you did. And then you got a movie out of it. So that's a pretty good deal.
Yeah.
You know, and that's independent of its eventual success as a movie, because even if it lands at any of the levels of success it could land at, you got to make a movie. And so that's pretty good. And God only knows what you learn doing that. So there's no loss in that, right?
Yeah.
There's just gain.
There was an interesting thing that I realized during this whole thing, and it is related to what you just said. So for many years, I have told people that if you have an idea and you don't execute on it, your idea doesn't mean anything. Ideas are a dime a dozen, and it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
And what I realized in making this movie is that I was actually wrong.
Okay.
Because if an idea, it's worthless if you don't execute it on it. I get that. But the actual idea, that if you have an idea, if you have an idea and it's good, you can't even put a price tag on that thing. And that's why when you look at Hollywood makes a bunch of what are they called? Like reruns of the same movies, right? There's a reason for that. They have all this money to throw at ideas, and they just go, oh, well, you know what? Make the superhero movie again, make the space movie again. They just make the same movies often over and over again. And I realized that these, if you have a really good idea, you have to execute on it. You have to do something with it, because if you don't, it's like a mortal sin not to execute on a good.
Well, it's a
idea.
revelation, a good idea. It's a gift. It's grace.
Where does it come from? That's why I was kind of very
that's
curious when you
exactly
said that,
right.
because
I know the answer to that.
I look at it like, they know what molecules are in an amoeba, right?
Yeah.
We know what chemicals, and we know what's in it, but we can't make an amoeba. We can't make something alive. And just like in a movie or a book or a song, they know, you go to Nashville, they know what notes make a hit song, but they can't just produce a hit song. They can put all the chemicals in there, but they can't bring it to life. And so there is, just like there's something special about life, there's a spark that we don't understand. We can't fabricate it. We cannot fabricate that spark in life. And we can't, as far as I can tell, we can't fabricate that spark of an idea.
Okay, so there's a bunch of things that come off that. So one of the things I realized, so I've done a lot of lecturing again this year. I don't know how many different cities we went to, 60 or 70, over the last 8 months, maybe more than that, a lot. And I have a chance to develop my ideas every night. One of the things I came to understand more clearly was, this is a very cool thing, and it's relevant to what you just said, is that the spirit of your aim, you could say, answers your prayers or informs your thoughts. And it has to be that way, because thought is a navigation tool, right? You set an aim, and then your perceptions line up so you can see your way forward, but your thoughts and your emotions also aid that, because you want to get there, let's say. And then the methods by which you might advance come to mind because you've set your aim. Okay, so we can take this apart in this idea that came to you. It's like you wanted to serve your children. Okay, you wanted to serve them in a manner that was better than what was being served to them. You wanted to serve them in a manner that would help them develop in this adventurous way. So that was your goal, your aim, when you went to the library. And then what happened was, there was a mismatch between what you discovered and your aim. And so now that constitutes a problem, but it also constitutes an opportunity, right? Because now you see that if your aim was correct and there's a void, well, then that's a moral problem even. Okay, so now if it's a moral problem because your aim was right and the mechanisms for that aim to be manifested aren't available, well, then that's a genuine gap and it needs to be addressed. And if you figure that out, it's your moral responsibility to do something about it, but it's also your great opportunity. Okay, so there's that. So that's what you're serving. If your aim is correct and true, and you have a revelation in relationship to that aim, and you don't act on it, you've thrown away the pathway to that aim and you've betrayed it. That's not a good idea. But even more concretely, one of the things my wife has really learned to do in the last 2 years, she started to write and she started to speak publicly, because she introduces me and talks for about 10 minutes. And she's learned during our discussions, our private discussions, let's say, if an idea emerges, she writes it down right away. no matter what we're doing, right? The idea comes, you write that thing down because it's a gift, and God only knows what it's worth. You know, you could have a good idea now and then. It might be a good idea that changes your whole life, and you could have that idea and be casual enough to forget it, and that was that. And then you'd wonder why you never got anywhere. It's like, well, you had a gift and you didn't. And then there's another issue too, is the things that meet with reward grow. That's a neurological truth. That's how large language models are trained. They're trained with reinforcement. The closer they get to the target, the more weight is put on that response. So it's literally reward that trains large language models to match to target. Well, if you have a bit of a creative spark and and ideas are being revealed to you in concordance with your aim, and then you don't act on those, you punish them. You punish the source of the ideas. Just like demoralizing a kid. Like if a kid comes to you with ideas and every time they come, you say, oh, that's stupid, or what the hell do you know? Or you say, I'm going to do something about that, and then you don't. That kid will stop coming to you with ideas. And people do that to themselves all the time, all the time. Yep. And so you even have an obligation to you can watch this, you know. This is what I've been trying to teach people too, is if you want to improve your life, it's like, well, set that as an aim. I'd like things to be better. And then ask, what could I actually do that would move me somewhat in that direction? You'll get an answer. That's a good way to pray. That's a good way to pray.
And I've experienced two things here, and these are like the opposite ends of the spectrum. And this is, I think, a very positive thing for people to hear. If I was a young person, I would really like to hear this. So there are going to be times like you're talking about with your wife, where all of a sudden from nowhere, or from somewhere, but somewhere that we don't know and understand, all of a sudden there's an idea there.
The source of all revelation.
It shows up.
Yeah.
It shows up. I've had that happen to me, where it's like, boom, I wrote a book called Mikey and the Dragons. That came just boom. I just instantly had this idea. Boom, I wrote the book. Yeah. And I remember when I was an English major in college, and some of the old poets, they would claim that, you know, they just wrote this first, you know, the first draft, that was it. It was one draft, one shot. And there was sort of rumors about these that's not really happened. They found their notes. They'd written a bunch of drafts. But sometimes it's true. Sometimes you will get that inspiration, and it'll come and boom, you're done.
Yeah.
So you can sit around and wait for that. I don't recommend waiting for that, though. It may or may not come. Yeah. We can't control that. The other side of the spectrum, which I've also had this happen to me, and my silly term that I came up with for it is squeezing your brain. You have to like squeeze your brain and squeeze something out of it. And what I like is this idea, just to come full circle a little bit here. You know, I had this thing where I wanted to have lessons for my kids that they could read in a book. Yeah. And so I have that. There's my aim, what you would call an aim. Yeah. Well, I didn't immediately say, oh, okay, what I can have as a kid that's going through kind of kid problems, and his uncle, who's a Navy SEAL, can come and stay with him for the summer and he can teach him. I didn't have that. And I definitely didn't have the nuances of like, oh, he can get bullied by this kid. And
that fills in.
Right. But I squeezed on my brain and thought, what would be a good, and then all of a sudden, boom, you just start, you find your path, and the story will come, or the idea will come. And
well, that's part of that disciplined striving. Like I learned when I first started writing, I forced myself to sit and write every day. And some days I was highly productive, and other days I wasn't so productive. But every day, if I sat long enough, I was a little bit productive. Mm-hmm. And then I got better at being productive, and much better at not delaying sitting down. That took a long time, really years, to really get disciplined. I'm still learning that discipline, right? I mean,
how long do you write for at a time?
I max out about 3 hours. Okay. I find that if I write more than 3 hours continually, I get exhausted. Mm-hmm. So 3 hours is about right. And I've learned tricks like at the end of the writing session, write down what you're thinking so you can use that the next day and do it every day and so on. And I've got to the point now where I can write a newspaper article, a good newspaper article, pretty much in one draft. But that's taken 35 years of writing to manage that. But I learned early that if I sat long enough, I would write something that would be valuable, right? And some days it took like 45 minutes to get warmed up so that, you know, everything I wrote was just, painful to produce and not of very high quality. But if you persist, the thing that persistence, that's the other thing that's kind of interesting neurologically. You know, I already said, if you punish the source within you that gives rise to ideas, it will stop producing ideas. So that's a bad idea. But it's also the case that you want to make being creative the victor over all the competing pulls and temptations. And partly what you're doing when you're disciplining yourself is that. It's like, no, I'm going to sit here, regardless of all the other things I could be doing, all the other things I could be thinking, until that part of me that's able to create wins that internal battle and prevails. And then it gets stronger and stronger over time. And that's building character. That's exactly what that is. That's that willingness to gaze into the abyss, which is obviously what you were doing when you went to Ukraine. It's like, it's gazing into the abyss that makes you better. The thing is, and this is maybe where Nietzsche's idea is not as differentiated as it became. Sometimes your gaze can be forcefully directed towards the abyss, and then you're traumatized. If it's involuntary and accidental, it can kill you. The more it's voluntary, the more transformative it is. And that's part of that idea about facing death and hell. It's like, can you tolerate death and hell? And the answer is, this terrible answer is, yes, to the degree that you're willing to do it voluntarily. And then you might ask, well, why should I have to subject myself to death and hell? I'm innocent. And then the answer to that is, even the innocent must be voluntarily sacrificed to the highest.
That's such an interesting distinction. Voluntary suffering.
Voluntary, yeah. Well, that's why the central Christian doctrine is, pick up your cross and follow me. And I'm speaking not in religious terms saying that. I'm just speaking as a psychologist. It's like one of the things we've learned in the last 100 years is voluntary exposure to that which freezes and terrifies you in measured proportions is curative. The first thing I do as a clinician, if someone comes to me and says they're depressed, is ask myself a question. Well, what does this person mean by that? So I have to find out, because maybe they're not depressed, maybe they're hyper anxious, or maybe they're obsessional. Like, there's various forms of powerful negative emotion, so they need to be differentiated. But then the next question you have to ask is, well, are you depressed, or do you have a terrible life? Or is it some combination of the two? So if you're depressed, as far as I can tell, you don't have a terrible life. You have friends, you have family, you have an intimate relationship, you have a job or a career. You're about as educated as you should be given your intelligence. Use your time outside of work wisely. You're not beholden to alcohol or other temptations. You're engaged in the community in some fundamental sense, and all that's working. Now, if you have all that and you're feeling really awful, you're either ill or you're depressed. And so then sometimes there's a biochemical route to that, treatment of that. My experience has been as a clinician is if you're depressed, but you have a life and you take an antidepressant, it will probably help you a lot. Now, maybe you're not depressed. Exactly. You just have a terrible life. What does that look like? You have no relationship. Your family's a mess. You've got no friends. You've got no plan. You've got no job. You use your time outside of work, not only badly, but destructively. You have a drug or alcohol habit or some other vice, pornography addiction. You're completely unengaged in the surrounding community. You have no scaffolding whatsoever to support you in your current mode of being or you move forward. And then as a therapist, well, you do two things. Well, if it's depression per se, well, like I said, there's sometimes a biochemical route, a nutritional route. There's ways that can be addressed. It's probably physiological if you're, at least in part, if you're depressed but you have an okay life. Sometimes it's conceptual. You can turn to dreams, sometimes to help people, because dreams contain the seeds of the potential future. And if your person is a real good dreamer and you can analyze dreams, that can be really helpful. But that seems to be only true for more creative people. And for the people who just have a terrible life, it's like, okay, you have a terrible life. Well, let's pick a front. How about you need a friend, like one sort of friend. Do you know how to shake hands and introduce yourself? I'll have the person show me. So let's do it for a sec. So, yes, hi, I'm Jordan. And people don't know how to do that. And then they can't even get the ball rolling.
For the listener, Jordan just gave me a firm handshake.
Yeah, as opposed to a dead fish. You know, and there's these elementary social skills that hypothetically, if you were well cared for, you learned when you were like 3. And sometimes I had lots of clients to whom no one ever paid any attention. And they needed like 10,000 hours of attention. And some of that was just listening, because they had 10,000 hours of conversations they never had with anyone. And they were all tangled up in their head. And they had to just, one client in particular, I worked with this person for 15 years. And what she wanted from me was for me just to shut the hell up for 50 minutes. It was very hard for me. And to just tell me what had happened to her. And then what happened at the end of the conversation, then I could discuss a bit with her. And then as we progressed through the years, the amount of time that we spent in discussion increased in proportion in the sessions, until by the time we stopped seeing each other, when my clinical practice collapsed, we were talking about 80% of the time. But she'd never been attended to properly, ever. And so she was an uncarved block in the Taoist sense, right? She hadn't been subjected to those flaming swords that separated the wheat from the chaff. And so you can do that in therapy. If you're listening and you're depressed, I would say, if you can't find a therapist, and that's getting harder and harder, because it's actually become illegal to be a therapist now, because you have to agree with your clients, which is a terrible thing to do with them. Just like it's terrible just to arbitrarily oppose them. You could do the self-authoring program online, because it helps you write an autobiography. And so if you have memories that are more than 18 months old that bother you when you think them up, part of you is locked inside that. An undeveloped part of you is still trapped in that. That's a metaphorical way of thinking about it. That's why it still has emotional significance. So you can write about your past experiences, but I would say wait for at least 18 months if something bad has happened to you, because otherwise you just hurt yourself again by encountering it. You can bring yourself up to date with an autobiography. There's an analysis of faults and virtues. That's the present authoring. And then there's a guided writing exercise that helps you make a future plan. That's young men who do that, to go to college, young men who do that, 90 minutes, just the future authoring, 90 minutes, they're 50% less likely to drop out. That's all it takes. Like, I had clients who were so depressed they literally couldn't get out of bed. So what's their first step? It's like, can you sit up once today? No. Can you prop yourself up on your elbows once today? Like, you scale back the dragon till you find one that's conquerable, that moves you forward. There's a rubric for life. Scale back the dragons till you find one conquerable, and it'll give you a little bit of gold, commensurate with the struggle. But the plus side of that, because you think that, God, that's depressing. You mean I have to start by sitting up? Well, you do if you can't sit up. But the plus side of that is, it's the Pareto distribution issue, is that aggregates exponentially increase. And failures do too, by the way, but aggregates exponentially increase. So once you start the ball rolling, it can get zipping along pretty good. This person that I talked about was incapable of sitting with me in a cafe when we first met, just talking, even though I was her therapist. But by the end, she was doing stand-up comedy. So, it took years, but Still, most people won't do stand-up comedy. That's quite the bloody achievement. She would read her poetry on stage too. So for someone who was petrified into paralysis by social anxiety and who had to start very small, it was a hell of an accomplishment.
If you're suffering, you are obligated, in a sense, to hold on to whatever rope someone throws you. Life can be meaningful enough to justify its suffering. You can tyrannize yourself into doing things, but I wouldn't recommend it. What I would recommend instead is that you ask yourself what you're willing to do. It's a really effective technique. It's like a meditative technique. That's when life is worthwhile. I don't know exactly what's going to help you, but don't arbitrarily throw out any possibilities because you might not have that luxury. Antidepressants help a lot of people, and there are technical reasons why that's the case. If you're offered a gift by your society and it works, try it. I don't care what your presuppositions are. The time you see people who are suffering with depression, for example, there's a multitude of reasons, but I'll take one common reason. You could think about it as associated with the story of Peter Pan. Peter Pan is someone who won't grow up, right? Now the problem with Peter Pan is he gets to be king, but it's king of Neverland. Neverland doesn't exist. So being king of nothing isn't that helpful. Well, one of the things that you often see with people who suffer from depression, and I'm not making a blanket statement about the cause of depression because there's lots of them, is that people who don't have enough order in their life tend to get overwhelmed. So for example, if someone comes into me to see me and they say they're depressed, I always ask them a very standard set of questions. Do you have a job? If you don't have a job, you're really in trouble in our society. First of all, your biological rhythms tend to go off the rails right away because there's no reason to go to bed at any particular time and there's no reason to get up. And for many people, if they don't get up at the same time, they foul up the functioning of their circadian rhythms, and that's enough to make them depressed right off the bat, especially if they start napping during the afternoon. They also don't have a purpose. People aren't good without a purpose, and this isn't hypothesizing. We absolutely understand the circuitry that underlies positive emotion. When you're attending to something you're interested in and you're engaged in it, that's when you're alive. That's when life is worthwhile. It's so worthwhile that in those moments you don't even ask the question about it. The question itself goes away because the meaning that you're united with is so powerful that it can push back the adversity that would otherwise characterize life. Nietzsche said, the person who has a why can bear any how. We know how it works. Almost all the positive emotion that any of you are likely to experience in your life will not be a consequence of attaining things. It will be a consequence of seeing that things are working as you proceed towards a goal you value. That's completely different. And you need to know this because people are often stunned, for example. They finish their PhD thesis and their presupposition is that they're going to be elated for a month. And often instead they're actually depressed. And they think, oh, what the hell, I've been working on this for 7 years and I handed it in and what do I do now? And that's what depresses them, right? It's the what do I do now? Well, they're fine if they enjoyed it pursuing the thing. As long as it was working out, they get a lot of enthusiasm and excitement out of that because that's how our nervous systems work. Most of your positive emotion is goal pursuit emotion. If you take drugs like cocaine or amphetamine, the reason they're enjoyable is because they turn on the systems that help you pursue goals. That's why people like them. So if you don't have a job, you got no structure, that's not good. Plus, you tend not to have a point. So you're overwhelmed by chaotic lack of structure and you don't have any positive emotion. Assuming you want to get better, there's usually something you can figure out that would constitute a step towards some sort of concrete goal. And my presumption, it's a behavioral presumption fundamentally, is that small accruing gains that repeat are unbelievably powerful. You can tyrannize yourself into doing things, but I wouldn't recommend it. What I would recommend instead is that you ask yourself what you're willing to do. It's a really effective technique. It's like a meditative technique. So for example, you can get up in the morning and you can think, well, I'd like to have a good day today, so I'd like to go to bed tonight without feeling guilty because I, didn't do some things I said I was going to do, and I'd like to have kind of an interesting day. So you got to fulfill my responsibilities and I want to, enjoy the day. Then you can ask yourself, well, what would I have to do in order for that to happen that I would do? And the probability, if you practice this for 3 or 4 days, is your brain will just tell you. It'll say, well, you know, there's that piece of homework that you haven't done for like 3 weeks. You should knock that sucker off because it would only take you 10 minutes and you've been avoiding it and torturing yourself to death for 72 hours straight. And say, well, let's figure out what your aims are. You got to have some aims, whatever they are. And they might say, well, I'm so depressed I don't have any aims. And then I say, well, pick the least objectionable of the aims and act it out for a while and see what happens. Because sometimes your emotional systems are so fouled up that you have to pretend, you have to act the thing out before you can start to believe it. Life can be meaningful enough to justify its suffering. I thought, God, that's such a good idea. Because it's not optimistic exactly. You know, some people will tell you, well, you can be happy. It's like, those people are idiots. I'm telling you, they're idiots. There's going to be things that come along that flatten you so hard you won't believe it. And you're not happy then. And so if life is to be happy, well, in those situations, what are you doing? Why even live? But life isn't to be happy. If you're happy, you're bloody fortunate, and you should enjoy it. You should, because it's the grace of God, so to speak. People know when they're doing something meaningful. They can tell. So why the hell don't they do meaningful things all the time? It seems obvious. You could do it. I mean, it's hard, you know, because other people want you to do other things, and it's a struggle, but everything's a struggle. Oh, I get it. I see why. It took me about 10 years to figure this out. People have a choice. Choice number one. Nothing you do means anything. Well, that's kind of a drag, right? It's meaninglessness of life and all that, existential angst. You know, that's kind of a pain. But the upside of nothing that you do is meaningful is you don't have to do anything. You've got no responsibility. Now, you have to suffer because things are meaningless, but that's a small price to pay. The alternative is everything you do matters. Really. If you make a mistake, it's a real mistake. If you betray someone, you tilt the world a little more sharply towards evil rather than good. It matters what you do. Well, if you buy that, then you can have a meaningful life. But there's no mucking around. It means responsibility. It means that the decisions you make are important. It means that when you do something wrong, it's wrong. Well, do you want that? Here's another rule. Pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient. This is also a great thing to know, I think. That's a tricky rule. Expedient might be, we're going to have a conversation, and I want something from you. And a lot of conversations are like that, you know, because you have a goal in mind. This is what I want from this person. And so then you craft your conversation to get what you want, right? You subordinate your words to the ethic of your desire. And you might say, well, what's wrong with that? Well, what do you know about what you want? Like, haven't you been wrong about that before? Or you might say, well, what's the alternative? Well, is there an alternative? Well, you have to want something from the person to even interact with them. It's like, no, you could want to see what happens. You could want to play. You could tell the truth. That's an interesting thing to do, because you don't know what's going to happen if you tell the truth, that's for sure. You could let go of what you want and just say what you think. And you could presume, and this is an act of faith too, that the truth does set you free, and that the truth that's spoken properly makes out of possibility the order that is habitable and good. And then you could just tell the truth, and you could see what happens, and that would be an adventure. And that's better than expediency, partly because maybe you're wrong about what you want. You know, and you know that because you're kind of narrow and maybe narrowly self-serving from time to time, and your purview of the world isn't as wide as it could be, and you're a bit bitter, so you tend to be that narrowly selfish because of that. And so you want something from a conversation, and you bend and twist it to get it. It's like, fine, but maybe you'll get something you don't want. Or worse, you'll get something that's positively bad for you. That happens a lot. And so part of the reason there's a deep moral injunction to tell the truth in a religious sense is because there's a hypothesis behind that, which is there isn't anything better that can happen to you than what will happen to you if you tell the truth.
Now, that might be hidden from you because sometimes if you tell the truth, and I don't mean to blurt everything out carelessly, like this is a sophisticated thing to do. It's not careless. It doesn't mean just say any old thing that pops into your head. You have to be judicious with the truth. But the notion would be, if something emerges as a consequence of engaging truthfully, and it doesn't seem to be going your way, wait. There's more to the story to unfold, because like, how do you know if it goes your way or not? Like, over what time span are you calculating this? Because sometimes things can go pretty badly initially and then much better as they progress. And lots of times the truth has that effect, because you reveal something that's maybe disturbing or shocking even to yourself and to others, and it causes waves, especially if it's a deep truth, and that destabilizes everything. It's like, yeah, but maybe that's preferable to a false peace. You can't find out if it's true without doing it. You're not going to gather the evidence beforehand. So that's the truth side of it. Meaning, pursue what's meaningful instead of what's expedient. It's another hint, like the spirit of play, about the pathway. The yin and yang symbol, the famous symbol, it's two serpents, one black, one white, head to tail. Inside the black serpent, there's a white dot, and inside the white serpent, there's a black dot. And the representation is something like, the world of your experience is made up of chaos and order. And order is where you are when things are going according to what you want. And chaos is everything that can come in and disrupt that. And both of those can be positive and negative. Too much order, tyranny, right? Too much chaos, nihilistic uncertainty. Optimized balance. So let's think about what the optimized balance would mean. You have a structure of perception and conception that you inhabit. It's orderly, reasonably orderly. Orderly enough so that when you inhabit it, most of the time things are going the way you want them to go. But things change and shift, and you don't know everything you should know. So you can't just stay where you are with a good thing. You have to expand. And as you expand, you move out of the domain of order into the domain of chaos, or out of the domain of actuality into the domain of possibility. And then you might think, well, how do you know when you're doing that optimally? Well, one marker, as I said before, maybe that you do it in the spirit of play. But another is, and this is so much worth knowing, things get meaningful. People ask, does life have any meaning? It's like, why is anything worth doing if in 4 billion years the sun is going to envelop the earth? And the answer to that question is, that's a stupid question. And I can prove that in some sense. It's like, you're a mother and your baby's crying, and so you're going over there to do something about it. And someone comes along and says, why do you care if that baby's crying? In 4 billion years, the sun is going to envelop the earth. And what's the right response to that? It's something like, go away. Are you out of your mind? And the answer to that question is yes, you are out of your mind. Of course, you can find a time frame or a spatial frame of reference that makes everything you do pointless. It's like, what is this going to matter in 20 trillion years? Well, it's like, the only proper response to that is, that's not a wise time frame. Imagine you're in a concert, listening to some great music, and it's got you, and someone taps you on the shoulder, and this is going to come to an end. And well, what's your response? Like, go away. And that's the right response to that voice in your head that does those things to you, which says, you're engaged in something, and a nihilistic thought comes out. Well, what's the point of this, given, how unbearable the world is in the current political situation, and the fact that we're inhabiting some ball of dust on the edge of some fringe part of the cosmos, and that everything's dead and material. It's like, get thee behind me, Satan, right? Really. It's not a mark of wisdom. It's not a mark of wisdom to let nihilistic, demonic voices steal your joie de vivre. That is not a mark of wisdom. And you might object, well, at least it's not naive. It's like, yeah, cynicism might be preferable to naivety, but it doesn't hold a candle to wisdom.
And that's worth knowing too. Because once you've been hurt and you're cynical, there's no going back to naive. But there's no point in staying at cynical. And there are degrees of courage way beyond cynicism. And some of that is the regaining of the faith you had as a child despite your current level of wisdom. And that's something to strive for, right? That's a moral attainment. That's not a burying your head back in the sand. Quite the contrary. And so, well, back to the yin and yang symbol. Imagine you have an instinct that orients you. Well, you do, as a matter of fact. There's a reflex that's replicated at multiple levels of your nervous system, and it's ancient. If you have a nervous system as an animal, you have this reflex. And the reflex is something like surprise. You know, if I walk across the stage and I hear a loud noise behind me, I might go like this. And that would be automatic because I'm gripped by unconscious systems. And what's happening is some chaos has emerged and it stops me in my tracks because something unexpected happened. My current plan is incomplete. And then I'll turn and orient towards the place of the disturbance. And that's the beginning of exploratory behavior. And then I might run away, which might make me safe, or I might cautiously investigate, in which case I can find out what caused the disturbance, maybe rectify it, and maybe update my plan so that that sort of thing doesn't happen again. That's a better approach.
Let's say you want to become who you could be in the fullest sense. So let's say you're someone who's going to solve some serious problems. Okay, the first thing you have to do is admit to the seriousness of the problems. That's no joke. And so the first thing is just the terror of the problem itself. And that's enough to paralyze you, right? And that's the Hydra, that's the Gorgon with the head of snakes. It'll paralyze you and turn you to stone. That's the basilisk in the Harry Potter series. You look at it and it turns you to stone and lurks underneath everything, right? And it's malevolence and tragedy. And so there's that. And then the next is, well, you're going to take responsibility for that? You're really going to do that, are you? That's a hell of a load, man. And so it's daunting to even consider that. And then there's the discipline and responsibility that necessitates, which is also daunting. It's like, oh my God, the problem's that serious. I'm really going to have to get my act together in order to not contribute to it, much less solve it. And so the problem is terrible. And then the solution is daunting. But the upside of that is like, well, there isn't anything better to have than a problem that's worth solving, like that's really worth solving, right? And so the more of that you take on, the more you have a reason to get out of bed in the morning, no matter what. Like, I'm getting up, I'm trudging forward. Doesn't matter what I'm suffering from. I've got things that need to be done. They're necessary. And that gives you that sense of purpose that is the antidote to bitterness. Okay, well, let's say you want your life to be meaningful. It's like, okay, then what you do matters. It actually matters. Or how starting to clean up the room changed their life. That's quite fun because it's something I always tell people to do instead of going out and protesting. Jesus, I just can't stand
Cleaning up
that.
the room?
Yeah.
Meaning?
Well, my sense is that if you want to change the world, you start from yourself and work outward because you build your competence that way. It's like, I don't know how you can go out and protest the structure of the entire economic system if you can't keep your room organized. Well, I made a video call, which was called Message to Millennials, where it was called How to Change the World Properly. A bit of on the pretentious side, I suppose, but I was trying to produce something that was a counterposition to this idea that what you should do is go out and fix up other people. You know, that's just not right. And there's a New Testament line about that, something about, you know, not worrying too much about the log in your neighbor's eye or about the speck in your neighbor's eye when you have a log in your eye. What would the world be like if people stopped avoiding the things they knew they should do? You know, because the question is, how much are we contributing to the fact that life is an existential catastrophe and a tragedy? How much is our own corruption contributing to that? That's a really worthwhile question. The things you leave undone because you're angry, you're resentful, you're lazy, you have inertia. Well, you consult your conscience and it says, well, you know, that place over there could use a little work. It's the same as working on yourself, and so you clean that up because you can. And then things are a little clearer around you. And you're a little better off because you've practiced a bit and And so you're a little stronger, and then something else manifests itself and says, well, maybe you could like take a crack at fixing me up too. So you decide to do that, and then that gets a little bit more pristine, you know, and soon, and it's humble because you're not exceeding your domain of competence. You know, it's like, don't be fixing up the economy, 18-year-olds. You don't know anything about the economy. It's a massive, complex machine beyond anyone's understanding, and you mess with it at your peril. So, and can you even clean up your own room? No. Well, you should think about that. You should think about that. What could you do to improve yourself? Well, let's step one step backwards. The first question might be, why should you even bother improving yourself? And I think the answer to that is something like, so you don't suffer any more stupidly than you have to. And maybe so others don't have to either. It's something like that. You know, like there's a real injunction at the bottom of it. It's not some casual self-help doctrine. It's that if you don't organize yourself properly, you'll pay for it, and in a big way, and so will the people around you. Now, and you could say, well, I don't care about that, but that's actually not true. You actually do care about that, because if you're in pain, you will care about it. And so you do care about it, even if it's just that negative way, you know. It's very rare that you can find someone who's in excruciating pain who would ever say, well, it would be no better if I was out of this. It's sort of pain is one of those things that brings the idea that it would be better if it didn't exist along with it. It's incontrovertible. So you get your act together so that there isn't any more stupid pain around you than necessary. Well, so then the question might be, well, how would you go about getting your act together? And the answer to that, and this is a phenomenological idea too, it's something like, look around for something that bothers you and see if you can fix it. So now you think, well, let's say you go into you can do this in a room. It's quite fun to do it just when you're sitting in a room, like a room, maybe your bedroom. You can sit there and just sort of meditate on it and think, okay, if I wanted to spend 10 minutes making this room better, what would I have to do? And you have to ask yourself that, right? It's not a command, it's like a genuine question. And things will pop out in the room that you know, like there's a stack of papers over there that's kind of bugging you, and you know that maybe little order there would be a good thing, and you know you haven't, there's some rubbish behind your computer monitor that you haven't attended to for like 6 months, and the room would be slightly better if it was a little less dusty and the cables weren't all tangled up the same way. And like if you allow yourself just to consider the expanse in which you exist at that moment, there'll be all sorts of things that'll pop out in it that you could just fix. And you know, I might say, well, if you were coming to see me for psychotherapy, the easiest thing for us to do first would just be to get you to organize your room. You think, well, is that psychotherapy? And the answer is, well, it depends on how you conceive the limits of your being. And I would say, start where you can start. You know, if something announces itself to you, which is a strange way of thinking about it, as in need of repair, that you could repair, then, hey, fix it. You fix 100 things like that, your life will be a lot different. You know, I often tell people too, fix the things you repeat every day, because people tend to think of those as trivial, right? You get up, you brush your teeth, you have your breakfast, you know, you have your routines that you go through every day. Well, those probably constitute 50% of your life. And people think, well, they're mundane, I don't need to pay attention to them. It's like, no, that's exactly wrong. The things you do every day, those are the most important things you do. Hands down. All you have to do is do the arithmetic. You figure it out right away. So 100 adjustments to your broader domain of being, and there's a lot less rubbish, and there's a lot less rubbish around, and a lot fewer traps for you to step into. And so that's in keeping with Jung's idea about erasing once you've got your mind and your emotions together, and once you're acting that out, then you can extend what you're willing to consider yourself and start fixing up the things that are part of your broader extent. Now, sometimes you don't know how to do that. So you might say, imagine you're walking down Bloor Street and there's this guy who's like alcoholic and schizophrenic and has been on the streets for 10 years. He sort of stumbles towards you and, you know, incoherently mutters something. That's a problem. And it would be good if you could fix it, but you haven't got a clue about how to fix that. You just walk around that and go find something that you could fix, because if you muck about in that,
not only is it unlikely that you'll help that person, it's very likely that you'll get hurt yourself. So, you know, just because while you're experiencing things announce themselves as in need of repair doesn't mean that it's you right then and there that should repair them. You have to have some humility. You know, you don't walk up to a helicopter that isn't working and just start tinkering away with it. You have to stay within your domain of competence. But most of the time, if people look at their lives, you know, it's a very interesting thing to do. I like the idea of the room, because you can do that at the drop of a hat. You know, you go back to where you live and sit down and think, okay, I'm going to make this place better for half an hour. What should I do? And you have to ask, and things will just pop up like mad. And it's partly because your mind is a very strange thing. As soon as you give it a name, a genuine aim, it'll reconfigure the world in keeping with that aim. That's actually how you see to begin with. And so if you set it a task, especially, you have to be genuine about it, which is why you have to bring your thoughts and emotions together, and then you have to get them in your body so you're acting consistently. You have to be genuine about the aim, but once you aim, the world will reconfigure itself around that aim, which is very strange. And it's technically true. You know, the best example of that, you have all seen this video where you watch the basketballs being tossed back and forth between members of the white team versus the black team, and while you're doing that, a gorilla walks up into the middle of the video and you don't see it. It's like, you know, if you thought about that experiment for about 5 years, that would be about the right amount of time to spend thinking about it, because what it shows you is that you see what you aim at. And that, man, if you can get one thing through your head as a consequence of even being in university, that would be a good one. You see what you aim at. And so, because one inference you might draw from that is, be careful what you aim at, right? What you aim at determines the way the world manifests itself to you. And so if the world is manifesting itself in a very negative way, one thing to ask is, are you aiming at the right thing? Now, you know, I'm not trying to reduce everybody's problems to an improper aim. People get cut off at the knees for all sorts of reasons. You know, they get sick, they have accidents. There's a random element to being, that's for sure. And so you don't want to take anything, even that particular phrase, too far. You want to bind it with the fact that random things do happen to people, but it's still a great thing to ask.
The Greeks had the maxim, know thyself. How do we come to know ourselves in terms of our personalities and, more importantly, potential? Well, one of the first ways to come to know yourself is to understand that you don't. You know, you can learn to kind of watch yourself like you're watching a stranger. You have to adopt a position. It's a position of radical humility, I would say. Humility in two senses. So one sense would be the humility of recognizing your ignorance. So you have to understand that you don't know who you are. That's not easy to understand, because you think you know, but then, you know, you remember you can't control yourself very well. You're not very disciplined. You're full of flaws. Maybe you don't know yourself as well as you think, but it's hard to get low enough to understand how deeply it is the case that you are ignorant about who you are. Now, there's an upside to that too, which also is that you're also ignorant about who you could be. And so the discovery of that, you know, is some reward for the horror of determining who you actually are. And then I would say, well, then you watch yourself. You watch yourself like you're watching a stranger. You watch what you say and you listen. And you think, well, what sort of person would say that? And how am I reacting emotionally when I'm communicating in that manner? Is that making me feel stronger or weaker? Is it filling me with shame? Is it helping my confidence? Am I laying out a lie? Am I deceiving myself and other people? Am I adopting this personality at parties that is designed to impress and to amuse, and it comes across as nothing but self-centered narcissism? What are my dark fantasies? What are my aggressive fantasies? What is it that I'm willing to do? What am I interested in so that I'll spontaneously pursue it? What do I procrastinate about and why? What am I unwilling to do? What do I think is good? What do I congratulate myself for accomplishing? And what do I berate myself for failing to confront and to implement? Those are all incredibly complicated questions, and you don't know the answers to them. So that's a start. And then in terms of potential, well, you'll discover a little bit more about your potential as you discover who you are, especially the darker parts of yourself, because then you discover your potential for mayhem. There's some real utility in that. It's actually something that strengthens you, because the first thing that a realization like that can in fact produce is the ambition to incorporate that dangerousness into a higher order personality. And that can make you implacable. That can make you someone who can say no when you need to say no. That can make you someone who won't avoid necessary conflict. And so that's unbelievably useful. And so that's one of the potentials that you might discover. The other thing you do to discover your potential is you challenge yourself. It's like rule 4 in my book, 12 Rules for Life, is compare yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today. And that's kind of a good way to start this. It's like, take a bit of a look at yourself and think about what's not so good that you could improve, that you should improve by your own standards, and that you would improve, and set yourself a little goal. Maybe you're not studying at all at your university, or maybe you're at work and you've got this stack of paper there, and you haven't looked at that damn stack for like a month, and you know that you should be, and you're bothering yourself at night because you're avoiding that. You think, I've avoided that stack of paper completely for 1 month. I'm quite a coward when it comes to whatever snakes might be hidden in that stack of paper. How about tomorrow I just put that stack of paper in front of me on my desk and I glance through it for 15 seconds. See if I can do that. It's like, you set yourself a goal of improvement. It's a humble goal, because really, are you such a coward that the best that you can bloody well manage after a month of avoidance is 15 seconds of exposure to a stack of paper? It could easily be. You've been avoiding it. You're obviously afraid of it. And so the situation could be that dismal and dire. And you might think, geez, it's no balm to my ego. It's not fostering the strength of my ego to recognize in myself someone who could only withstand 15 seconds of exposure to that thing I'm afraid of. And so that's a form of humility too. It's like, there's things you could do to improve, and you know what they are. And there's small steps that you could take, that you might take, that would put you in that direction. And then the question is, are you big enough to take those small steps? Are you capable of grappling with the fact that you're fundamentally flawed to the point where you have to break things down into almost childlike steps in order to manage them? And the answer to that is, yeah, you are. And that's the lot of, I don't know if it's the lot of everyone. Most people have things they avoid, and they're afraid of. So I would say to some degree, it's the lot of everyone. People vary in the degree to which they've conquered that. And you do meet people from time to time who are extraordinarily disciplined. But most of the time, they've got disciplined in exactly this manner. It's through slow incremental improvement. And then you challenge yourself. It's like, could I do this? That would be better. Then you find out, and then you think, is there something slightly larger and more challenging that I could do that would be better? And you try it and you find out. And as you try it and you find out, generally you get better at it, and you can take on larger and larger challenges. You take responsibility for yourself. That's part of standing up straight with your shoulders back. It's like, take on the world, man, but only at the level that you can manage. When you're ignorant and biased and deeply flawed and immature, it's where everyone starts. You don't want to bite off more than you can chew, but it doesn't mean that you can't wrestle with part of reality. Some part that's small enough so that you have a good shot at victory. And to put yourself together, this first steps towards that is to allow yourself to be a fool, right? It's because you don't know what you're doing. You have to admit that. And there's going to be a loss of ego or destruction of ego, arrogant ego that necessarily accompanies that. But you need the loss of that arrogant ego, because it's precisely what's interfering with your movement forward. It's part of the adversarial process, mythologically speaking, that stops moral progress. You're too proud of who you think you are to notice what you're like so that you could change properly. You don't want to sacrifice that part of yourself. It's probably associated with some delusion that helps you maintain a positive, although very fragile self-image, in the absence of genuine effort. It's not to be recommended. You know yourself by watching and paying attention. It's watching like you're a snake. A snake watches like cold-bloodedly, with no emotional reaction, just to see what's there. It doesn't allow, symbolically speaking, doesn't allow what is wanted or desired to interfere with what is observed. So you watch yourself like that, as if you don't know who you are. Well, that's the beginning. And then you challenge yourself continually to see how far past yesterday you can push today and tomorrow, and to continually experiment with expanding the domains not only of your competence but of your ability to increase that competence. And the upper limit to that is proportional to the moral effort that you put into it. The more that's guided by the highest of all possible visions, right? The alliance with the highest of all possible conceivable good. And the more it's accompanied by truth in speech and action, the more you will develop your potential. And you also, I suppose, have to be willing to undertake that as an adventure, because it's a hell of a thing to bear that kind of responsibility. It takes a person out of the ordinary. It takes them out of themselves. And there's an alienation and an isolation that goes along with that, and a great sorrow, all of that together. But there's deep meaning to be had in it, and there isn't anything better that you can do. So that's the answer to that question.
What emotion do you feel when you're going to approach someone you're very attracted to, and there's an extremely high probability that she's going to tell you to disappear? Right, exactly, absolutely, because it's a real judgment, right? We're going to see a movie called Crumb where you'll see this in great detail. But it's a real judgment. It's like the best judgment is, well, I don't mind your physical presence, but your genes should definitely not survive another generation. Right, and that's sort of generally translated into, I think we should just be friends. Right, and you can blow that off, and people do, and you have to, because it's part of being polite and civilized. But let's make no mistake about it. There is no more fundamental judgment than that. So, paralysis. And there's no shortage of men, who are absolutely terrified of women. I've had many of them in my practice. I had one guy, he was so terrified of women he couldn't even talk to them on the phone. It's more common than you think. So, but it's generally manifested by men who no one cares about, so it's generally irrelevant. So, well, it's the case. It really is the case. I'm not kidding. They're low status men. They're people that are generally regarded as losers, and there isn't anybody who really gives a damn about what happens to them one way or another. And there's a lot more men in that category than there are women. Women are in all sorts of, social categories that cause them misery and distress, but that one seems to be predominantly male. One of the things I'm going to do when we talk about Freud is I'm going to show you this movie Crumb, which I just told you about, and it's a very rare thing, because it shows you the world from the perspective of very intelligent male losers. And that's just not a perspective you ever see, because it's the winners that tell the stories about their life. It's like, who the hell cares about the life of a loser? But this movie is about a loser who became a winner, and almost as an act of revenge. And it's great. It's great examination of the Oedipal complex. Remarkable. Women select men. That makes them nature, because nature is what selects. And so, you can say, well, it's only symbolic that women are nature. It is, not in some sense, is the gatekeeper to reproductive success. And you can't get more like nature than that. In fact, it's the very definition of nature. So, as I said, there are lots of reasons why these symbolic representations are set up the way they are. Alright, so that's the great mother, nature. The queen, the matrix. The matrix is something from which all things form. Same root word as matter, mother, all the same root word. The matriarch, the container, the cornucopia, the object to be fertilized, the source of all things, the fecund, the pregnant. there are more parts of the associational network. The strange, the emotional, the foreigner, the place of return and rest, the deep, the valley, the cleft, the cave, hell, death, and the grave, the moon, ruler of the night, and the mysterious dark, and matter and the earth. So those aren't necessarily associated with femininity, but they're typically associated with femininity from a symbolic perspective. You know, so like generally, like a witch in a movie doesn't come riding out of the full bright sun at noon, right? That just doesn't happen because it doesn't make sense. It's a dark thing. And so if you saw that occurring in the light in a movie, you'd think, you know, what the hell's going on here? That doesn't make sense. And the reason it doesn't make sense is because it violates the complex, the symbolic complex. So those are female denizens of the underworld and hell. Very pleasant creatures. It's like Medusa with the head of snakes, you know. And if you ask, you know, why would a woman have a head of snakes in reference to a man? And that's really simple. I bet there are men here who know the answer to that. I don't know what you guys think about this, but I was pretty happy when I thought this up, and it took me a long time. So, if you think about the world in Darwinian terms, right, it's a struggle for survival and reproduction, which are basically the same thing. Survival is you, but reproduction is the survival of your genes. So it's a survival issue over very long spans of time. Okay, what do we call the selection mechanism? Right, natural selection, right? It's nature who does the selection. Okay, so let me tell you something that makes female humans different than female chimps. I mean, there's lots of things that do, but but here's an important one. If you look at which male in a chimp troop fathers most of the offspring, it's the dominant male. But the reason for that isn't because the female chimps sort of flock around the dominant male. Now that happens in other species, but it doesn't happen with chimps. What happens is the dominant male chases all the subordinate males away and will interfere with any sexual behavior they manifest. It'll chase them away. The females, though, are perfectly happy to mate with a subordinate male if they're in heat and they get the opportunity. So they go into heat, which is something that doesn't happen with female humans, and they really don't care who they mate with. Okay, female humans are much different than that. They're picky. So they're choosy. It's a big deal. It's a big deal that they're choosy. Women also seem to evaluate men for their fitness. Now, so, lots of men have no sexual partners and they have no children. That's not the case with women. Almost all women have one child or more. And it's a rare woman indeed who cannot find a sexual partner. Some of you undoubtedly have already experienced what it's like to be possessed by a particularly stupid idea. You know, so maybe you've grown out of one or two of the stupid ideas that possessed you, or maybe you're possessed by an attraction to someone you can't control, or you can't control your eating behavior, or you're a pushover when it comes to interpersonal interactions because you're too agreeable, or you fly off the handle and fight, and you know, none of this is really under your control. And so all of those things that manifest themselves not only in your behaviors but in your perceptions themselves, you know, they tend to take on embodied form and use you as the vehicle for their activity. So, you know, when you're thinking about something like anger, for example, think about how it works, because it's quite peculiar. What must someone generally do? How must someone generally act if you're going to be angry at them? They have to be irritating, right? You know, they have to provoke you in some way. Well, the mere fact that you perceive what they're doing as irritating or provoking doesn't ensure that anyone else would have thought about it, or that that's what they meant, or that that's what's happening. And my point is, it's very important to think about these complexes of ideas as subpersonalities, because otherwise you really don't get what they're like. If you're angry, if you have a proclivity towards anger, especially if it's an unthinking proclivity, anything that someone says might irritate you. And it isn't like they say something and you think about it and then you get irritated. It's like you perceive the person as irritating. You know, maybe it's just the way they hold their mouth or something. It can be very, very subtle. And you might say, well, it's not me, it's you. It's not that I'm irritated by you. It's that you're irritating. And that, you know, that's a very difficult thing to settle, because the reality is somewhere between the subjective and the objective, right? A lot of arguments that you'll have with people throughout your life are about exactly that. Are you irritating or am I oversensitive? It's like, well, you know, we're going to hash that out for a good long time before we figure it out. But the point is that if you're possessed by an emotional state or a motivational state or an idea or some kind of complex, you'll see the world through its eyes. And then the facts reveal themselves to you through the lens of that particular set of ideas. So it's a very frightening idea because, you know, we like to think of ourselves as masters of our own house, which is completely clueless because it's obvious if you watch yourself for like a month that you hardly ever do what you tell yourself to do, and you're liable to do all sorts of other things that you don't even want to do. You know, because you say, well, I'm going to go to the gym 3 times a week and I'm not going to drink, you know, and maybe there's this person I'm not going to associate with, and then, you know, you don't go to the gym and you find that person and you go out and drink with them and you think, what the hell's going on, you know? But you're not the sort of person that will do what you say. And so, like, what sort of person are you? Well, that's a psychoanalytic question. It's a deep one, because you're a peculiar thing, and there's parts of you that are really, really, really old, and you know, the sort of naive you, the naive young you that you think of yourself as is like a little piece of flotsam in an ocean of complexity, and the ocean of complexity is you. And part of diving down into the depths is to start to understand what it means to be human, and like whatever that means, it's the one thing you can say about it for sure is that it's bloody peculiar.
You're sitting on the edge of the bed trying to have an honest dialogue with yourself, and the little voice says, you know, it's pretty disgusting in here. And you think, well, I'm way above such trivial niceties as organizing my room. It's like, well, that's pride. That's arrogance. If you're above organizing what's actually yours, how in the world are you ever going to organize anything else? And so you get on your knees and you think, well, it's time to, you know, take a brush to the toilet. And maybe that's where you start. And that works. Like, that works. You start making those micro improvements, like real micro improvements, real on the ground, actual micro improvements to things you know that are wrong, you'll improve unbelievably rapidly. There's always people out there who are doing far better than you on pretty much anything you want to imagine. And if all you're doing is seeing yourself in their reflected light, let's say, then it's going to be pretty damn dismal. But it's not a good comparison because, well, first of all, there's danger in just comparing yourself to others, period, because they're not you. And God only knows what struggles they had to undertake to get to where they were, or what burdens they're currently carrying that you're not aware of. But you can certainly contrast yourself with yourself. And that's a lot better. It is the only way. Well, it's also the only way of really measuring anything approximating proper improvement. You can actually tell when you're a little better than you were yesterday.
Right.
And you can actually do that. That's another thing that's so interesting about it, is that you can actually make yourself a little better in some way, pretty much. Well, I don't know if it's at every moment, but you can certainly do it every day. Let's say you want to become who you could be in the fullest sense. So let's say you're someone who's going to solve some serious problems. Okay, the first thing you have to do is admit to the seriousness of the problems. That's no joke. And so the first thing is just the terror of the problem itself. And that's enough to paralyze you, right? And that's the Hydra, that's the Gorgon with the head of snakes. It'll paralyze you and turn you to stone. That's the basilisk in the Harry Potter series. Mm-hmm. You look at it and it turns you to stone and lurks underneath everything, right? And it's malevolence and tragedy. And so there's that. And then the next is, well, you're going to take responsibility for that? You're really going to do that, are you? That's a hell of a load, man. And so it's daunting to even consider that. And then there's the discipline and responsibility that necessitates, which is also daunting. It's like, oh my God, the problem's that serious. I'm really going to have to get my act together in order to not contribute to it, much less solve it. And so the problem is terrible. And then the solution is daunting. But the upside of that is like, well, there isn't anything better to have than a problem that's worth solving, like that's really worth solving, right? And so the more of that you take on, the more you have a reason to get out of bed in the morning, no matter what. Like, I'm getting up, I'm trudging forward. Doesn't matter what I'm suffering from. I've got things that need to be done. They're necessary. And that gives you that sense of purpose that is the antidote to bitterness. Okay, well, let's say you want your life to be meaningful. It's like, okay, then what you do matters. It actually matters. Or how starting to clean up the room changed their life. That's quite fun because it's something I always tell people to do instead of going out and protesting. Jesus, I just can't stand that.
Cleaning up the room?
Yeah.
meaning?
Well, my sense is that if you want to change the world, you start from yourself and work outward, because you build your competence that way. It's like, I don't know how you can go out and protest the structure of the entire economic system if you can't keep your room organized. Well, I made a video which was called Message to Millennials, where it was called How to Change the World Properly. A bit of on the pretentious side, I suppose, but I was trying to produce something that was a counterposition to this idea that what you should do is go out and fix up other people. You know, that's just not right. And there's a New Testament line about that, something about, you know, not worrying too much about the log in your neighbor's eye, or about the speck in your neighbor's eye when you have a log in your eye. What would the world be like if people stopped avoiding the things they knew they should do? You know, because the question is, how much are we contributing to the fact that life is an existential catastrophe and a tragedy? How much is our own corruption contributing to that? That's a really worthwhile question. The things you leave undone because you're angry, you're resentful, you're lazy, you have inertia. Well, you consult your conscience and it says, well, you know, that place over there could use a little work. It's the same as working on yourself, and so you clean that up because you can, and then things are a little clearer around you, and you're a little better off because you've practiced a bit, and so you're a little stronger, and then something else manifests itself and says, well, maybe you could like take a crack at fixing me up too. So you decide to do that, and then that gets a little bit more pristine, you know, and soon, and it's humble because you're not exceeding your domain of competence. You know, it's like, don't be fixing up the economy, 18-year-olds. You don't know anything about the economy. It's a massive, complex machine beyond anyone's understanding, and you mess with it at your peril. So, and can you even clean up your own room? No. Well, you should think about that. You should think about that. You only have to ask a stupid question once. You ask a stupid question, and if you're in a crowd and you ask a stupid question, 80% of the people in the crowd have the same question. They're just too cowardly to ask. But you ask and then someone actually tells you, you never have to ask that question again. You're no longer stupid. What stupid thing am I doing that I could quit doing? That I would quit doing? Because those aren't the same thing, right? Because you know there's stupid things that you're doing that you're just not going to quit doing because you like them. But there might be something on the edge there where you could stop that. If you want to know something about yourself, sit on your bed one night and say to yourself, you got to mean this, like you got to be desperate. This is no game, this. My life is not everything I want it to be, and perhaps it's not everything that I need it to be. And by need, I mean my life is so unbearable that the suffering that's attendant upon that is make me nihilistic, cynical, bitter, resentful, driving the proclivity to see evil everywhere except within my own heart. Like, these are problems, man. And you ask yourself, you sit on the bed and say, okay, man, I'm ready to learn something. What's one thing I'm doing wrong that I know I'm doing wrong, that I could fix, that I would fix? It's like, you meditate on that, you'll get an answer. And it won't be one you want, but it'll be the necessary one. You know, and it's often something that will point you to small things. Like, that works. You start making those micro improvements, like real micro improvements, real on the ground, actual micro improvements to things you know that are wrong, you'll improve unbelievably rapidly. There's never been a better time for the majority of people to be alive. And the future, although we're vulnerable and terrible things can always happen to us, it's hard to make a case that the future doesn't look comparatively positive. We're becoming extremely technologically sophisticated, and the world is changing at an incredibly rapid rate, and the only way we're going to be able to manage that in a positive way is if each of us, or as many of us as possible, are capable of making wise and careful and truthful decisions. And if we do that, then maybe things can continue to improve. You don't get people to stand up on their own 2 feet and to adopt responsibility if everything is given to them. And that's a real conundrum. It's known from multiple dimensions simultaneously that the system that produces happiness, let's say in the founder's sense, produces that emotion in relationship to the observation of movement towards a valued goal. And so you can derive some conclusions from that. The first is that
Without a goal, there's no happiness by definition, because happiness marks movement towards a valued goal. The next is, well, the higher the goal, the more value there is in the observation of movement towards it. And so out of that, you might ask, well, then what's the highest goal? Because why don't we go for that? Well, then you could say, well, you should do your best for the best. You might say, well, that's just to make me hedonically happy. It's like, well, wait a second, you know, cocaine will work for that, because it actually even activates this system. But what about tomorrow and next week and next month? And so the problem with hedonism as a goal is, first of all, it vanishes when you're suffering. But even failing that, if you're serving yourself hedonically in the narrow sense, it's just about me and my pleasure. It's like, okay, which you? Today's you, tomorrow's you, next week's you, next month's you. What about next year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? You're going to lead a hedonic and dissolute life, and what are you going to be, a burnt-out shell and a wreck, a dismal wreck in 10 years? Because that's what will happen. And so if you don't construe yourself as a community stretched out across time, then you're not even serving yourself. And if you do construe yourself as a community stretched across time, then serving other people and serving yourself turn out to be exactly the same thing. I just did a course on the Sermon on the Mount, and Christ, in one of the sections of that sermon, he says to people that you shouldn't lose your saltiness, you shouldn't lose your savor, and you're the salt of the earth, and without that salt, everything loses its flavor. And salt is a preservative, and it's a spice, and that's often conceptualized, that phrase, as referring to the salt of the earth, you know, the solid, reliable types who bear all burdens. But that is not what it means. I looked at a lot of different translations. I talked to a lot of people about that verse, and really what it means is, well, there should be some spiciness and unpredictability and humor about you. And there should be some play in the system, right? Because that's what stops you from just being the narrow, dead, past letter of the law with no spirit. There should be some snake inside the tree, right? There should be some fire inside the bush. Those are all ways of construing that are symbolically equivalent. There should be some dynamism in you, and a fair bit of that's associated with, well, enthusiasm. That's fun, but enthusiasm means to be imbued with the Spirit of God. That's why people like comedians so much too, because that's what they do. And so you have to leaven the duty with humor, and your book does a lovely job of that too, because your book, which is a very conservative book in the best possible way, and is a call to duty and responsibility, but you constantly return to themes of both stoicism and humor, which are tied together in some sense. You know, I was just in Newfoundland for the last week doing a documentary there. Newfoundland's a rough rock, and it's beautiful and harsh. And the people there are tough and resilient, man, because they had to be. And Newfies have a great sense of humor, and they're always making fun. And that's a necessary leaven, right? That ability to deal with serious matters in a light with a light touch. And it's something I'm trying to learn to do more and more, even in the most serious of conversations, you know, because if you're a master, you've got both. You've got that light touch and that sense of humor. You really see that in military people who've been through rough situations. When you see someone in the depths of genuine suffering, hopefully what you're trying to do is to throw a lifeline. And one possible lifeline is compassion. And that's probably the right lifeline to throw an infant, you know, who's suffering. That sort of overwhelming compassion. But for someone who is an adult or making progress towards being an adult, the lifeline that might be thrown is, there's something within you that would let you be more than you are, and much more, and maybe enough more, so that you could actually deal with this suffering so it didn't turn into hell and take everything along with it. And there isn't anything more optimistic than that. You say something here, which I think is extremely, I'm going to read something from your book here. It is true that character is to some extent innate. I would say what that does is that it provides each of us with a range of talents and a range of temptations. And so it's something like that. So It's the hand we're dealt, and there's certainly a genetic element to that. Our genetic makeup imbues in us certain proclivities, but it is as true that character is mostly a consequence of choices. Strangely enough, we all make them, and we should make them deliberately, with the knowledge that these choices are part of our responsibility toward a purpose other than our own selfish aims. That responsibility is to your family, friends, community, and country. That's something that conservatives put forward as a pathway to virtue. You know, and what's so interesting about that, as far as I'm concerned, as an antidote to atomistic liberalism, let's say, that hyper-privileges the individual, is that it's definitely been my observation as a clinical psychologist that in the depths of misery, the capability that you have to be of service to other people, your family, your friends, your community, your country, that's actually a saving grace under such circumstances. You know, and that people really find a deep and abiding meaning in that service. So it's not just finger wagging and the pointing towards duty. It's like, no, no, you don't understand that if you're in desperate straits, if your life is falling apart, if you're nihilistic and miserable, and maybe you have your bloody reasons, because maybe you do, that's still the case that if you step outside yourself and you try to make the lives of other people better, that's the best possible thing that you can do for yourself.